apresentação da Sban já está lá? Sim. Pode colocar?
Sim, já pode colocar. No palco, a gente...
Bom dia a todos. O meu nome é Lara Natassi, gostaria de agradecer a presença de todos aqui. Estou aqui como presidente interina da Sban e tenho a missão de apresentar a Sban para vocês brevemente, antes da gente começar o nosso evento. Eu queria primeiro pedir para vocês, para a gente fazer uma pequena reflexão, um exercício de reflexão. Eu queria que vocês imaginassem, junto comigo, uma mesa onde nós tivéssemos membros da indústria de alimentos, membros do governo, membros da academia, pesquisadores, profissionais de saúde e membros da sociedade, conversando com base na ciência sobre alimentação e nutrição. Conseguiram imaginar? Sem extremismos, baseados em evidência científica. E é isso que a Sban faz já há 40 anos. Essa é a minha apresentação da Sban para vocês, porque esse é a nossa missão, esses são os nossos objetivos como Sociedade Brasileira de Alimentação e Nutrição. Tá? E a gente pretende continuar promovendo a ciência, entregando profissionais e todos que trabalham com alimentação e nutrição, para que a gente consiga orientar de forma prática, simples e factível a alimentação da nossa população brasileira. Certo? E também com parcerias internacionais. Bom, é isso que nós fazemos, então nós produzimos conhecimento através de publicações, posicionamentos, também documentos técnicos e com essas parcerias todas com todos esses stakeholders que falam de alimentação e de nutrição com o objetivo de trazer ciência para a população. Tá? Nossa missão, que vocês podem ver no nosso site também, e o nosso papel é desmistificar que existem alimentos bons e ruins. Né? A gente sabe que tudo pode fazer parte aí da nossa alimentação da população brasileira e de qualquer outra população. Né? Sempre com base na ciência, sempre sem extremismos, né? E sempre muito bem fundamentado, com evidências robustas, né? Porque a gente sabe também que existe evidência para tudo, certo? Bom, a gente tem associados nesse sentido, né? Como a gente integra vários stakeholders de toda a nossa sociedade, a gente tem associados pessoas físicas, que são as pessoas que trabalham de alguma forma, que têm alguma atividade com alimentação e nutrição, e assim como pessoas jurídicas. Aqui são os nossos associados, pessoas jurídicas. Gostaria de agradecer a presença de todos aqui também. É uma alegria ter todos vocês aqui conosco. E queria convidá-los a se conectarem com a gente, a se associarem, né, e se conectarem com a Sban. Queria muito agradecer a organização do evento, queria agradecer o Rodrigo Stefani, que trouxe os nossos palestrantes também. Agradeço a Márcia Terra pela organização, ao Dr. Thomas Henle, à doutora Susana Socolovsky, que vão abrilhantar esse nosso evento com muita discussão científica. Muito obrigada, gente. E chamo aqui ao palco o Rodrigo Stefani, que vai dar início ao nosso evento.
Bom dia a todos. Né? Então, gostaria de dar as boas-vindas, inicialmente, em nome da Sban e também em nome do Departamento de Química. Está sendo uma grande oportunidade, porque a nossa universidade ela tem uma parceria, né, com a Alemanha, e foi realmente uma grata coincidência nós estarmos exatamente nessa época do ano, com uma equipe da Alemanha, em algumas atividades que são em parceria com uma fundação da Alemanha, que é a Fundação Humboldt, e coincidiu, né, da oportunidade de a gente poder trazer o professor Thomas até São Paulo, para que ele pudesse, né, conversar com vocês um pouco sobre o posicionamento da UPF do ponto de vista da química de alimentos. Tá? Na verdade, essa colaboração que nós temos com a Alemanha, ela visa aproximar os dois países. Né? A Fundação ela só apoia poucos projetos no mundo, e um desses projetos foi selecionado para ser realizado aqui com o Brasil. A química de alimentos na Alemanha é uma especialidade extremamente forte, e a Universidade Técnica de Dresden é a universidade mais antiga do mundo que oferece o curso de química de alimentos. Porque pela grande preocupação que eles tinham, principalmente no final de 1800, com a qualidade dos alimentos, com a segurança dos alimentos, e a Universidade Técnica foi a primeira a oferecer isso. E é com grande satisfação, né, que o professor Henle, ele coordena e movimenta essa área, principalmente na Alemanha, sendo uma referência para a gente. Essa decisão de ter um projeto, né, bilateral, ela veio sendo construída há muitos anos. A área de alimentos ela é muito vasta, obviamente, né, tem muitas áreas de engenharia, muitas áreas de qualidade, mas a essência muitas vezes está lá na química e por isso a gente tem essa contribuição. Então, só gostaria de agradecer a oportunidade, né, dizer para vocês que talvez uma das maiores referências do mundo na área de química de alimentos vai estar aqui com a gente hoje, podendo conversar com vocês e mostrando um posicionamento científico real em relação a essa temática que a gente está discutindo hoje, que é o UPF. Né. Então, muito obrigado pela oportunidade. E gostaria de convidar a Márcia Terra, né, para poder dar continuidade.
Bom, pessoal, sem muita delonga, eu queria agradecer, né, vocês todos os parceiros da gente estar discutindo esse assunto, que é um assunto que está em voga hoje no Brasil, né, onde ele nasceu, e no mundo todo, e todo mundo sabe que é um assunto que eu mergulho muito de cabeça. E o Rodrigo disse, né, uma coincidência. Eu acho que não existem coincidências na vida, né? Eu acho que esse caminho já está cruzado. E quando eu soube que o Thomas estava vindo para o Brasil, eu perguntei se ele conseguiria ter uma agenda, né, porque a agenda dele estava cheia. Aí o Rodrigo espremeu tudo. Eles chegaram ontem à noite, o evento tinha que ser agora de manhã, eles vão embora depois do almoço correndo. E aí eu conversei com a Susana, que estava em Washington, no UFOS, no IFT, e aí falei, Susana, o Thomas está vindo para o Brasil, ela falou, quero muito encontrar com ele, e aí a gente conseguiu. Então, assim, realmente, nós estamos aqui com 2 dos maiores especialistas nessa área para discutir um tema tão controverso e tão polêmico como esse. Então, eu acho que assim, a gente está aqui. Ainda bem que a gente conseguiu fazer ele online, né? Nós estamos com quase 600 inscritos online e vai ficar gravado, né? Mas é uma oportunidade assim inenarrável. Eu vou chamar o Thomas agora para falar e depois vem a Susana e ao final a gente vai abrir para as perguntas, ok? Obrigada, Thomas. Ok. Here it's the point further.
Now you can hear me better, obviously. Oh, okay, great. So once again, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to start thanking the organizers, in particular Marcia and Marina, for inviting me to this meeting, for organizing this meeting on a very short notice, and for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts on Nova and ultra-processed foods with you today. Before I begin, I would like to make 2 preliminary remarks. First, I would like to emphasize that my presentation and my comments in the next, let's say, 30 minutes or so, are in no way intended as a personal attack or as an individual, let's say, personal attack on individual supporters of the Nova classification. Better? Is it better in this way? Hopefully. Then I start again, because it's very important for me to start with this preliminary remark again, okay? So, let's try again. Second start. Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. Still, it's a great pleasure to be here. I would like to thank the organizers for organizing this conference, for inviting me on a very short notice, and for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts on the Nova classification with you today. Before I begin, I would like to make 2 preliminary remarks. First of all, I would like to emphasize that my presentation in the next 30 minutes and my comments on the Nova classification are in no way intended as a personal attack on individual representatives or supporters of the Nova classification. I do not want to accuse anyone of anything, And I do not want to attribute any malicious intent to those people who are in favor of the NOVA classification. My sole intention today is to evaluate the NOVA concept and possible implications from a strictly scientific point of view. I want to express my concerns as a food scientist, and I want to express these concerns with scientific arguments. I solely want to point out that what I see as possible risks resulting from an uncritical application of the NOVA concept, risks which result for food and nutrition science, and risks which also result for the food safety and beyond. I'm putting my arguments forward to discussion with you within the scientific community. My second remark is some kind of a disclaimer. I would like to point out that I was invited to this conference. The flight from Rio to Sao Paulo was paid by the organizers, and one night in this hotel was also paid by the organizers. In no way I was paid for my presentation, and also the text of my presentation, the lecture I will give in the next 30 minutes, was in no way discussed with the organizers. So I solely show you my personal views, okay? So my presentation will be divided in two more or less general topics. I would like to begin with a very brief definition of what constitutes an ideology and of what constitutes science. I think such definitions are important for the next 30 minutes. In the second part of my presentation, I would like to talk a little bit more about general aspects of food processing from the view as a food scientist. And I would like to reflect in what respect the NOVA system has introduced a new dimension in this discussion. The main point of my presentation, which is part 3 and part 4, will then be trying to evaluate the NOVA concept from a scientific perspective. And in the fourth part, I will share my thoughts with you, attempting to point out very specific signs that NOVA is much more than a concept for classifying food, but that the NOVA concept contains very concrete signs of a well-founded ideology, from which both scientific and social risks can be derived. And at the end of my presentation, point 5, I will try to attempt to draw conclusions from this and try to reflect on what we can do as food scientists. So, ladies and gentlemen, the title of my presentation is NOVA, Science or Ideology. And let us first briefly consider what the difference is between science and ideology. So as scientists, and I think that we here are scientists, we are committed to strict objectivity and to a strict validity of our results. Science seeks empirical testing of proposed theories. Science begins with an idea, an assumption, a hypothesis, which is then tested, published, and thus open for discussion, and thus potentially falsified. There may be scientists which come to other conclusions, and then this theory is falsified. That is the fundamental nature of science. In other words, we try to obtain results on evidence and reproducible findings to explain the world. That's the job of us scientists. And through this search, the rigorous search for objectivity, personal or even social bias should be kept to a minimum. It's not about our personal opinion, it's about objectivity and science. Science must be verifiable. An ideology, on the other hand, is something completely different. An ideology represents a collection of existing ideas or beliefs that underpin the interests of individuals or of groups. It serves as a foundation for supporting social or political arguments and helps legitimize specific interests, specific viewpoints. An ideology also, let's say, plays a crucial role in defining how knowledge is interpreted and disseminated within the society. Often this process is based on a biased and selective acceptance of information where facts are chosen which emphasize, which support the view of the group. In this way, ideology not only shapes how people think and act, but ideology also influences the ways in which the societal issues are understood and communicated. Ideology also influences how science is communicated. Against this basic definition, and I would like to try to discuss these two aspects, science versus ideology, in relation to ultra-processed foods and to Nova. Well, as far as I trace back, ladies and gentlemen, it was about 2009 or 2010 when the first paper was published concerning ultra-processed food. It was a commentary. It was not an original study. It was a comment by a Brazilian scientist on this subject. We will take a closer look on this initial paper later. And a few years later, let's say starting at around 2014, 2015, there was a rapid increase in the number of papers which was published on this issue. A linear increase we can observe throughout the last years. Currently, there are about 700 to 1,000 papers per year published on ultra-processed foods. And you all know, of course, the public perception of ultra-processed foods. Ultra-processed foods are, well, let's say, blamed for everything which is bad, so to say. Ultra-processed foods are associated with obesity. Ultra-processed foods are linked to all kinds of health issues. They are linked to early death. They are blamed for increasing environmental pollution, and they are also discussed as a contributing factor for climate change. And there is a corresponding article in Wikipedia. Some of you may have looked this up already. And here we see clearly the basic nature of this theory of ultra-processed foods. Ultra-processed foods are understood as industrial creations. Artificial foods are something artificial, created by the industry, manufactured from natural foods, using food additives and whatever processes. They are synthesized, so to say, and the sole purpose of synthesizing these artificial foods is the profit of the industry. The term ultra-processing or ultra-processed foods thus represented a completely new perspective on food processing, which was unheard in our area of food and nutrition science until, let's say, 2010. If we as classic food chemists, food scientists, nutritionists were to address the topic of food processing, which we do, for instance, in our lectures or in our public presentations, we would argue similar to what is presented here. This is the homepage, the website of the European Food Information Council, maybe similar to the organization of today. The European, this UFIC is a non-profit organization dedicated for providing scientifically sound information on food and relations to health. UFIC is supported by the European food and beverage industry, and it is also supported by the politicians. It's also supported by the European Commission. UFIC presents a balanced view on topics of food processing prepared for the general public. And it clearly communicates that food processing is essential for consumers. It is shown here, and you can look this up in many other papers or documents published, that many advantages are associated with food processing. Food becomes safer. The food processing leads to avoidance of food waste, for instance. New foods can be created, example, to replace animal proteins, which is a very big issue in Europe and in Germany in particular. And of course, appropriately processed food should also be convenient for the consumer. It makes it, let's say, more usable in the daily routine. However, it is also mentioned here, it is also mentioned or acknowledged that food processing can have negative aspects. Specifically, food processing, for example, through extensive heating, can lead to a loss of nutritional value. The blocking of lysine as an essential amino acid may occur. Acrylamide or other process contaminants may be formed. It also does not hide, so the UFIC does not hide the fact that adding too much sugar, adding too much fat, adding too much salt to the diet may have health consequences. And that this can, of course, then lead to the creation of foods that are consumed in disproportionate quantities. All of this is textbook knowledge. All of this is taught by us in our daily lectures. We deal with chemical reactions, for instance, like this, the chemical reactions during food processing since decades. And this is just a small example of corresponding studies. Here's how we, as food scientists, would actually assess the impact of food processing on the quality of foods. What you see here are 3 types of milk, 3 types of differently terminally treated milk, pasteurized milk, high temperature pasteurized UHT treatment. I don't want to go too much into detail concerning the conditions. I also do not want to discuss the analytical procedures behind this. And of course, we see that with increasing temperature, there's a loss of vitamins. Of course, this loss of vitamins is the price we pay for the fact that this food is more, has a longer shelf life. This is basic knowledge. This is what we know since decades. But the NOVA concept now took a completely different approach. The starting point was, and this is certainly nothing wrong, that the representatives of NOVA began to address an issue that is of global importance for all of us, namely the growing problem of obesity, the worldwide problem of obesity. You can see here on this map, which I don't want to discuss in detail, that the proportion of overweight people in the world are extremely rising, with extreme consequences for the public health care. This topic is of great concern to many scientific institutions, for your institutions, for the food scientists and the nutrition scientists in Germany and in Europe. And we deal with this topic from various points of view, which is taken very seriously, I should say, from all of us. However, the idea behind NOVA now was quite different. It was about who is to blame for this obesity, for this epidemic. Here you can see that what I believe was the very first paper published on this topic. It was not an original scientific paper, as mentioned. It was a commentary by a Brazilian nutritionist who has now presented a completely new view on this topic. The core message of this paper was that it is not about ingredients. It's not about the impact of food processing on the nutritional value or so. It is about not the food per se. It's about, as you can see here marked in red, what is done to our foods. That is, what results from the food in the course of processing, and ultimately a new way of assessing food processing was induced, namely the term ultra-processing, which was completely unknown until 2010 or so. The author of this study now postulated that this, as a suggestion, it was a suggestion, a theory, a hypothesis, a basic proposal that the reason for the global obesity epidemic lies in ultra-processing. This was basic idea. And at the same time, it was made clear who is to blame for this obesity, namely the industry. The industry that profits from these highly processed, ultra-processed foods is ultimately responsible for producing them and therefore responsible for the worldwide obesity for the worldwide problem of obesity. And to solve this problem, a classification system has been proposed, which I don't want to discuss too much in detail because you all are aware of it. 4 groups of foods were defined, but NOVA was never about recording changes on nutrients during processing and a possible influence, let's say, on the nutritional value or so. The focus is what is done to our food, whatever that might be from a scientific point of view. And then these 4 groups were defined: Group 1, unprocessed, minimally processed; Group 2, single ingredients, isolated from these unprocessed foods. The Group 3 then consists of processed foods, meaning foods for which salt or whatever was added. And Group 4 would be these ultra-processed foods, often defined as industrial formulations of the Group 1, 2, and 3 foods. The criteria used to classify processed foods into groups 3 or 4 were not clear, are still not clear, which is probably the fact or the consequence that such a huge list had to be defined of examples which belong to this Group 4. This Group 4 includes, for instance, sugary soft drinks, ready-made products and snacks, packaged bread, margarine, processed cheese, yogurt drinks, infant formula, baby products, burgers, you name it. We all know that there is a huge number of publications now linking adverse health effects to these Group 4 foods, to these ultra-processed foods. And we could now try to interpret the multitude of epidemiological studies, try to show what is the real evidence, try to isolate individual food groups and so on, but I don't want to do this. All these studies are based on a dogma. They are based on the dogma of classification into these 4 classes of foods. This classification forms the databases for epidemiological studies. So let us now try to examine the database from a scientific point of view in order to answer the question of whether this classification actually has a scientific basis. I would like to highlight two key statements and use them to examine the validity of NOVA. The first one is the aspect that I believe has been not sufficiently addressed in the discussion, namely the fact that NOVA only deals with industrially produced foods, foods which are made at home or from culinary ingredients, as the author puts it, or foods that are made in good restaurants. We will see what is a good restaurant and consumed. They are not covered by NOVA. We will see later that this distinction alone leads to major problems from a scientific point of view. And the second aspect which I would like to comment on is this very general statement that you can see it here, or this was the first one, this is the second one, is the general statement that UPFs are nutritionally unbalanced. So we will now try, or I will now try to examine the scientific validity of this NOVA classification, and we'd like to do this on a very general, let's say, scientific theoretical basis. Namely, I will ask the question, what is science? Science begins with an idea, for example, the idea that ultra-processed foods are nutritionally unbalanced. This idea is then tested and falsified. And we are attempting to do this now on the basis of a scientific theory developed some years ago, or many years ago, by Karl Popper. Those of you who have studied food chemistry, food technology, so know this. And you have learned that the scientific method works based on falsifiability. Falsifiability is a key criterion to distinguish scientific theories from non-scientific statements. A scientific theory can never be conclusively proven, but must always be subjected to possible falsification through experiments, through discussion, and so on. Now let's look at some examples of the NOVA classification. Packaged bread, NOVA class 4. I will show you a concrete example here. On the left-hand side, you see a artisanal bread produced in Germany. You know the Germans are very proud of their bread, let's say, technology. Everybody in Germany loves bread. We have hundreds of different breads. And this bread on the left-hand side is made by an artisanal bakery in Munich, very expensive. And on the left-hand side, you see exactly the same bread, packaged, sold across the street, not in this small artisanal bakery shop, but in the supermarket who also buys this from the artisanal bakery and sells it. And this alone makes this artisanal traditional bread to a NOVA class 4 food. Just by packaging, just by putting some paper around it. Next example, burgers. Burgers are, by definition, NOVA class 4. You can eat a burger now in a fast food restaurant, of course, which costs around 3 to 4 euro on the left-hand side in Germany. And you can also eat a burger in a restaurant, like on the right-hand side, a very exclusive restaurant in Germany, where the same burger, not the same burger, but a burger with fries, costs around 10 to 15 euro. In terms of composition, in terms of nutritional value, they are probably identical. I don't want to comment on which tastes better or which does not taste better. It's just a matter of taste, I should say. But in terms of nutritional quality, both are more or less identical. Nevertheless, it is sufficient by the fact that the left-hand side, the burger on the left-hand side is made in a fast food restaurant, makes this burger to a NOVA class 4 food, and the right-hand is excluded. The right-hand food is excluded. So the line is now blurred, I should say, meaning that fast food restaurants are NOVA by definition, but what points out that the right-hand side burger in a good restaurant is good enough to not be covered by NOVA? Is it the price? Is it the location of the restaurant, or whatever? Here's another example which highlights a fundamental problem with the validity of the NOVA classification: ready-to-eat chili in a tin, which is by definition NOVA class 4, of course, because it contains, here it is, it contains modified starch and flavoring, which is made from celery, an extract of celery. And on the right-hand side, you see a chili, which similar taste. You can decide for yourself which you prefer, but this is homemade and is not included in NOVA, but the left-hand side sample is per definition NOVA. Let's now look at the second statement of the Nova? This is, by the way, the food I had when I arrived in Juiz de Fora. What is it, Nova class 4, 3, or Nova 5, or Nova 0? I like it very much, I must say. I don't even know how it's called, but you tell me. But it tastes delicious, but it is definitely not nutritionally balanced. But it's excluded from Nova. So I can eat it day by day, gain 3 kilos per month, but I'm not this is not due to UPF then. Okay, but this is just by the way. Now let's look at the second example, the second statement, namely whether UPFs are actually nutritionally unbalanced in terms of nutritions or in terms of nutrients. And I would like to do this by comparing the Nova classification with the so-called Nutri-Score. The Nutri-Score is a labeling system that was introduced in the European Union about 5 years ago as a labeling system on a voluntary basis. It serves to assign a score ranging from A to E for food systems or for foods, which means that foods with an A have a very favorable, very good composition. Foods with an E have a less favorable nutrient composition. This is calculated on the basis of the food composition. There's a very complex calculation scheme behind it. And there are certainly much criticism of this Nutri-Score, which I largely agree with, by the way, but it is a scientifically based labeling system. Foods which are high in salt, which are high in fat or added sugar, for example, are downgraded to D or E or so, and foods which are high in protein, which are high in vitamins or so, are upgraded to A or B. So this system can be helpful, and I will show you concrete examples in a moment where comparing foods within one product group may help the consumer to decide to buy the, let's say, more favorable food in terms of nutritional composition. However, I would like to point out this does not mean that A per definition is healthy and E per definition is unhealthy. Just to make it clear, there are no healthy and there are no unhealthy food statement. Yeah? It's just a matter of amount. Of course, you all know this, but I think this cannot be expressed too often. So there is no healthy and unhealthy food per se. Okay? Now we'll show you some examples on the use of this Nutri-Score. Here you can see 2 breakfast cereals from the same manufacturer. The product on the left-hand side is classified as C. The product on the right-hand side is A in terms of a nutritional point of view. The reason for this is that this item has less sugar, less saturated fat, so it's more favorable in composition, and therefore it is attributed as a Nutri-Score A, and the other one as a Nutri-Score E. However, let's look at Nova. According to Nova, breakfast cereals are per definition Nova 4, and this means that both of these food items are Nova 4. Another example is yogurt. Here we have 2 organic yogurt, one plain, one with fruit. The fruit preparation contains certain additives, namely E410, which is a thickener, and this makes it Nova class 4, although in terms of nutritional composition, according to the Nutri-Score, both are more or less identical. And another very extreme example is the comparison of milk with milk substitutes. On the left-hand side, you see a food item which is very popular, gaining much importance in Germany. This is especially among people who want to avoid animal food on a vegan diet or want to reduce the intake of animal protein. This is a milk, let's say a milk-based, a drink based on cereals, cereal milk, so to say. Okay? According to the Nutri-Score, this is A, and conventional milk is B, and the food on the left-hand side has also a very good CO2 footprint. This is a very, let's say, sustainable food. Well, according to Nova, milk is always classified as level A, and this product on the left-hand side is per definition a Nova class 4 food. Although such products are rated very favorably from both a nutritional standpoint and also from a sustainable perspective. They are categorized as highly processed according to Nova. By the way, this also goes for such meat alternatives, also quite favorable in terms of composition, but also per definition Nova class 4. And the final, and for me very extreme example, is infant formulas. Infant formulas are not classified by the Nutri-Score because They are designed to be close as possible to breast milk. Of course, it's common knowledge, and everybody of us knows us, including every nutritional communication, that breast milk is always the best food for infants. There's no doubt about this, but if it is necessary from a biological or medical reasons, or for whatever reasons, that the baby must be fed with milk substitutes, then fortunately there is a wide array, a wide range of corresponding products. However, according to NOVA, all of these foods are classified as 3, or all milk substitutes per definition as category 4. So imagine the uncertainty of parents of young children who are now being told that, from whomever, because the mother may not be able to breastfeed, that they feed their baby with foods that have been classified as harmful, as toxic, or as dangerous. So these examples alone are enough to show that there needs to be some serious scientific criticism of the NOVA system. There was a recent paper published 1 year or 2 years ago by colleagues showing that healthy dietary patterns include most of the energy of UPF most of the UPFs have a very balanced nutrient composition. So the term ultra-processed foods is scientifically incorrect, simply by taking this example. The basis for the classification is undefined and analytically indefinable. The major problem here, of course, is shown here now as an intermediate summary. All correlation studies conducted on the basis of this unscientific classification are completely unreliable. If you feed a system with poor data, you cannot expect good data. The phrase for this is garbage in, garbage out. Science based on invalid measures is invalid. So much for the food classification system. The main criticism are shown here. This the vague terminology, the database cannot empirically be tested. It ignores the nutrient content, which is the major criticism, and all epidemiological studies definitely must be flawed because the data input has the corresponding problems. Well, so much for the food science evaluation. In the next and this is my consequence based on this, that NOVA is not science. NOVA is not based on science as we know it, and UPFs from that point of view do not exist for me. So much for the food science evaluation. In the next section, we will look at the extent to which ideological principles can be identified in the NOVA classification, and especially in the papers dealing with it. So let's start with the first publication, or let's repeat about the thing, what is ideology? You can see here a set of existing ideas, that's what we had in the beginning. This is used to support political arguments, and ideology defines how knowledge is interpreted, and it is based on a selective bias. So this is the basis. Now let's look at the NOVA classification. Let's look at the papers dealing with this topic from this point of view. Let's start with the first publication, which already hinted, let's say, at the very borderline of ideology. I have picked out a few original quotes that should have alarmed the scientific community already at that time, I should say. The author of his publication goes so far as to claim that the reason why food processing and the effect of food processing on health has been overlooked until now is that, I quote, the biochemistry has diminishing relevance. The biochemistry is based on the results of the 19th and 20th century and has no relevance for the next years. In other words, the author is claiming nothing less than that natural sciences, chemistry, biochemistry, as the basis for assessing the composition and the physiological consequences of foods no longer play a role. First statement. He even goes so far as to claim that his statements go beyond conventional food science or conventional nutrition science, and that he wants to create an alternative nutritional science with NOVA. Why he considers this necessary? Because he believes that science is far too closely linked to food manufacturers, he doubts the integrity of the natural sciences. And building on this, namely the rejection of biochemistry and a scientific method, and the claim that science has been bought by the industry, is paid by the industry, he denies all critics to criticize Nova from the outset. This already in this first paper, a clear signs of an ideology. We see a naturalistic and a moralizing rhetoric in this terminology. Food is coded in binary terms. Nature is good, processing is bad. This is what we call a naturalistic fallacy, a mistake to assume that everything which is natural is good and everything which is not natural is bad. The discussion is then based on morally charged terms, and the food industry is demonized as a scapegoat. This communicates a deeply anti-modern attitude in the sense that everything was better in the past, no? And our food used to be natural 50 or 100 years ago, and this in turn creates the central basis for the identity politics of this ideology. So already in the beginning, we see quite clearly that Nova is much more than an attempt for a scientific hypothesis that is supposed to be discussed in the scientific community. Rather, from a point of view of the Nova supporters, a critical examination is not necessary at all, as it is usual for an ideology. And that is also evident, and you can see here the summary. We have this naturalistic moralizing rhetoric as a quick summary. Nature is good, processing is bad. The use of morally charged terms. So clean, real, industrial. The food industry is demonized, and this is a clear anti-modern bias. And of course, this is used then as an identity politic for the Nova supporters, because foods are seen as spoiled by the industry. And food choice now becomes not a scientific or taste-based or whatever decision. Food choices become moral choices. And this is also evident, you can see also these signs of an ideology in the way Nova deals with its critics. You see here a publication which, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, I have never encountered in this form in any other scientific debate. This publication attempts to prove that people who criticize Nova have close ties to the life science industry, have close ties to the to the industry, and thus, in a sense, are no longer valid to criticize. This is a bibliometric analysis. This was carried out, recording the authors of all critical publications which were published to that time. I think there's about 38 papers or so. These are the authors marked in red. You can read them. It's not important to read it, but just to show you how a pseudo-scientific approach was made in order to identify the authors of critical papers and then to find links of these authors. These are the green lines to the food industry. And the paper then states that in total 32 critical publications were found, 38 individuals, authors, were found that had contributed to this, and of these 38 authors, 33 were found to have proven links to the UPF industry. And the conclusion of this paper was then that the criticism of these 33 individuals was worthless because they are dependent on the industry. This is a delegitimization of criticism, and this is known in social sciences as so-called ideological gatekeeping. In other words, Nova critics are dismissed as unworthy or biased. The collaboration with industry is considered as morally disqualifying. This is shown here. So the critics of Nova are dismissed as unworthy. Industry is the ground for a moral disqualification. It reflects, as I mentioned, a so-called ideological gatekeeping. Only pure voices are accepted as critics, only the pure voices which have no ties to the industry. And this, of course, undermines what we as scientists know as pluralism and as open scientific debate. So what are the consequences of this? I think it is more than evident that the concept of Nova serves as a cultural narrative and the core of a broader ideology that shall shape our understanding of food and health. At its heart, Nova promotes a reactionary
food morality, presenting it as a pseudoscientific health advice, which in reality is often disguised as a moral judgment. It fulfills specific characteristics, I'm sorry to say that, of science denial. The ideology carries scientific and significant risks. It can create insecurity or even malnutrition by encouraging people to make food decisions based on simplistic classifications such as clean or dirty or natural or not. So this is shown here. It's a cultural narrative. It promotes reactionary food morale, and the risks are insecurity and malnutrition. It encodes a clearly anti-scientific and anti-industrial values. And the risk, of course, now is that we return to traditional gender norms. So food convenience is demonized, while home cooking is idealized, fostering some kind of a nostalgia for the so-called housewife area. Okay? Such narratives can undermine the progress of women's emancipation from domestic roles, subtly suggesting that women should stay at home, primarily responsible for the husband, preparing pure meals. Women in particular are the main target of the clean eating movement and the associated expectations of monthly responsibility. The ideal of food purity then acts as a disciplinary tool, regulating female behavior and reinforcing traditional roles under the guise of health and virtue. This is what you see here. So food purity becomes a disciplinary tool. And it fits very well with current social trends and the post-factual age. Maybe some of you have heard about this movement, about this tread wives movement. This is an anti-feminist movement started by women who see their future role as being similar to women in Europe or United States of the 1950s and 60s, namely to stay at home for their husbands, to prepare everything for them immediately, so that they, if the husbands come home from their daily work, in the evening they are greeted by a perfectly styled woman, a clean house, and of course a perfectly cooked dinner without UPFs. Thus, this tread-wide movement promotes a return to traditional female roles, woman as the homemaker, as a homemaker, mother, and of course a submissive wife. And a key part of this lifestyle is rejecting ultra-processed foods in favor of home cooking, of natural meals. Cooking thus becomes much more than a health choice. It's a symbolic rejection of modern consumer culture and feminist ideas. This movement carries anti-feminist undertones. It idealizes a past where women had fewer rights and defines female fulfillment primarily through domestic science. In summary, Nova challenges feminist goals such as independence and gender equality. So in summary, Nova is not just about food, ladies and gentlemen. It's a powerful ideological force that shapes social norms, especially regarding gender, health, and the authority of science. So what can we do as a consequence? What can we do as food scientists? Of course, we always have to claim that food science and science in general must be objective, neutral, and verifiable. The Nova system classifies this term ultra-processed foods, which does not meet these scientific standards. The term UPF should no longer be used in food science. This is our, let's say, our statement. So what can we do? My plea must be that we as scientists must emphatically ensure that science remains science. Science must be objective, as mentioned, neutral, evidence-based, and the Nova classification has not been proven to fulfill these requirements. We need a sound nutritional recommendations based on a differentiated analysis of the food composition, of the nutrients, and specific individual ingredients. Food and nutrition science must be based on evidence-based scientific concept and must not be guided by populistic, ideologically charged terminology. As a key consequence, I myself pursue my teaching at the university to clearly explain the problems with NOVA to our students, and I can assure you that no student who leaves TU Dresden will ever use the term UPF or NOVA within food science or nutrition. So as you may know, as a final slide, a few months ago, my colleague Hannelore Daniel from the Technical University of Munich and we have written an open letter on this subject, calling on the scientific community, the life sciences and nutrition sciences, to stop using the term UPF and NOVA. You can still sign this letter if you want. You can also see, you see the links here, you can also see who has signed so far. Currently, there are about 200 to 220 scientists from all over the world who have signed this. This may be a small contribution of bringing the food and nutritional sciences back to their fundamental evidence-based foundations. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Obrigada, Thomas. Queria chamar já imediatamente a Susana Socolovsky. A Susana foi uma das primeiras cientistas que, acho que ainda em 2009, 2010, aqui no Brasil, num evento do ILSE, ela comentou sobre a publicação da NOVA e com bastante assustada. Então, é um prazer tê-la aqui com a gente. Obrigada, Susana. E só um recado, para quem está no online, vocês podem passar, isso está sendo traduzido para o inglês, e vocês podem passar para o chat, né, as perguntas que a gente vai encaminhar para os palestrantes. E todas as perguntas que nós fizermos aqui, ao vivo, nós vamos fazer em português, tá bom? Que está tudo sendo traduzido. Obrigada.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Marcia. Bom dia a todos. I'm going to speak in English so that this talk can be translated and understood by Thomas. And so it's a big pleasure to be here today to speak to you about something that I've been speaking about in the last 16 years. So it is my pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank the organizers, and also I'd like to thank you for your presence and attendance. Okay, so we are going to discuss now the impacts of the NOVA system and the ultra-processed foods concept in public health policies in Latin America. So I need help with this. I guess this is it. Okay, I have it here. Which one is it? Okay. So first of all, I'd like to disclose my conflict of interests. I do work with industry in many aspects because my main field of work is the approval of new ingredients, new technologies, and new food additives in the countries of Latin America. And I've done this for the last 35 years. So I have links with the food industry. I have links with the food ingredient suppliers and food additive suppliers. And I also work with different law firms. I'm also very frequently, I've been working for the last 50 years, so I participate as an external advisor for many of the international discussion forums, such as Codex, Mercosur, and others. And I do belong to many scientific organizations. So having said that, let's discuss the agenda. Thomas has had a very clear view of what NOVA and the ultra-processed food concept is, and I hope you have followed his talk with attention. So I'm going to speak very shortly about the NOVA food classification system, the impact on Latin American dietary guidelines. I will explain how the Pan American Health Organization has reinforced and adopted the concept of ultra-processed foods, how this created and launched a lot of regulations around the Latin American countries that have to do with black warning labels on the food products. And I will explain the difference, because there is a big difference according to the country where these black signs are used. And also I will discuss some global evaluations of other entities, international entities, concerning this concept. So as you all know, the NOVA system history started with the sentence, "The issue is not foods, nor nutrients as much as processing." Of course, this has been said by someone who does not understand food processing or the food science. So there were many publications, as you know. They started in 2009, and up to date, you can find, as Thomas explained to you, more than 3,000 publications relating health issues to the different classifications, and mainly ultra-processed foods. And by trying to explain what an ultra-processed food is, the phrase was, "These are not modified foods, but formulations mostly of cheap industrial sources of dietary energy and nutrients, plus additives using a series of processes, and hence called ultra-processed." There's nothing ultra about processing. There's nothing, I repeat, there's nothing ultra about processing. We know ultraviolet, for instance, wavelengths. We know ultra or UHT milk. There's nothing ultra. Processes are not defined by simple or ultra. Processes are a means to obtain better foods, more nutritionally feasible, and from raw ingredients and materials. So the first one to notice that this concept was flawed was Nicole Darman. Nicole belongs to the French National Institute for Agricultural Research, and she pointed out the classification was imprecise, and precision is of the utmost importance for scientists, and that's what we are. We are food scientists. So I'll go very quickly on, I'll discuss this very quickly because you have already seen it. But the ultra-processed food and drink products, because they don't even deserve, according to the classification, to be called foods, so they are called ultra-processed food and drink products, were given a series of different attributes that have nothing to do with the nutritional content of the food. So they were seen as of poor nutritional quality, hyper-palatable, and quasi-addictive. And we all know addiction does not refer to anything but caffeine and alcohol in foods. Conducive to snacking, aggressively marketed, and all the things that you've seen in the discussion about ideology that Thomas mentioned before. So in Latin America, many of the dietary guidelines were based on this NOVA system. And the first one was the Brazilian dietary guidelines that appeared in 2014. And for your knowledge, this was written by the NUPENS group, together with the Ministry of Health. So it said processed foods limit the use of processed foods, the ingredients and techniques used in the manufacture of processed foods unfavorably alter the nutritional composition of the foods. So we're talking about what NOVA 3 classification category is. We're talking about olives in in brine or peaches in syrup. And avoid ultra-processed foods. And we will not discuss why we should avoid ultra-processed foods because you have already seen this. So as Thomas mentioned, because there's no definition of an ultra-processed food, the creators of the NOVA system just listed a bunch of different foods and beverages. And I just pointed out the packaged breads, as Thomas did, with a very good explanation. But the most important situation here appeared when in 2015, the Pan American Health Organization adopted the word ultra-processed foods and concluded that the association between annual sales per capita of ultra-processed foods and the increases of the body mass index could predict obesity. So this is the publication. They showed the different increases from 2000 to 2013 in Latin America and in other parts of the world. And I'm pointing out there Asia and the Pacific. They listed the annual sales per capita of ultra-processed foods in all the countries, and then pointed out that the more you bought ultra-processed foods, the more obese you would become. But they didn't notice, for instance, that by showing that Argentina was a big, was acquiring a lot of ultra-processed foods in kilograms per year, they didn't notice that Japan was buying a lot more. And obesity is 6% in Japan, the most, as in Korea. And in the other countries, it can go up to 30%, as Hungary, UK, the United States of America. So what they actually did was an association between sales and obesity rates. And as we all know, association is not causality. An association cannot show causation. And on top of this, on February 18th, 2016, the PAHO publishes the nutrient profile model. And also here, the nutrient profile model, in the introduction says the evidence supports the need to protect and promote the consumption of unprocessed and minimally processed foods and freshly prepared dishes made with them, plus certain culinary ingredients, butter, honey, lard, plant oils, salt, sugar, and other single substances extracted directly from food or nature and used as ingredients in culinary preparations to discourage the consumption of processed and ultra-processed food products. Again, here, the importance of culinary preparations. At this point in time, all the cooks around the world were so happy with the NOVA system because it gave restaurants a big chance for survival, right? Because if you prepare at home or if you prepare in a restaurant, the food is better because natural is better than industrialized, right? So PAHO classifies a food product has excesses in one or more critical nutrients if its relative nutrient content is higher than the corresponding maximum level recommended by the nutrient consumption goals that WHO, the World Health Organization, fixed in 2003. And if you look at the left of the slide, you will see a copy of the what is called the nutrient consumption goals set by the WHO in 2003 that apply to the whole diet of a person in a day, around 2,000 calories per day. And if you look at the different percentages, you will see that total fat cannot exceed 30%, saturated fat cannot exceed 10% in the total diet. Sugars, free sugars cannot exceed 10% of the total diet. I'm sorry. So I'm going back. And you see then the nutrient profile model by PAHO on the right-hand side, where you have the same percentages, but now they are applied to 1 yogurt, to one cookie, to one piece of hamburger, to one product. Of course, you have heard Thomas saying that according to NOVA, the ultra-processed foods are unbalanced. Okay, each product cannot be balanced in its own because we eat a very big array of products and foods during the day, and it is the diet which has to be balanced. So if we take a look here, in order to comply with the consumption goals by WHO, we need to eat a lot of foods during the day, some of which are very salty, some of which are very sugary, some of which are balanced, mostly are not. Okay, but the other thing that really ruined the possibility of reformulating foods, and especially sugary foods, by diminishing the amounts of sugar in the food, was the fact that PAHO decided that anything different from sugar, all polyols, all non-intensive, non-caloric sweeteners should be considered a critical nutrient. And based, in order to support this assumption, they mentioned 2 articles that I invite you to read because none of those articles indicates that exposure to sweet foods will make you want to eat more sweet foods. And that has been proven lately in a study that was published in the last 2 months. So the fact that PAHO introduces low and no calorie sweeteners as critical nutrients has been a big problem for the food industry. So here we have the PAHO document and the PAHO nutrient profile model, and the fact that any amount of polyols or non-caloric sweeteners should be pointed out as a critical nutrients. PAHO followed in 2019, published this document that showed what products should be taxed, what products should bear warning signs on the front of pack labeling. And on top of this, FAO accepted the publication of the NOVA system in a document that was published by FAO, and thus validating in a way to the eyes of the world that this was a concept accepted by FAO. But if you read the disclosure, it actually says that the contents are not necessarily the ideas or the beliefs of FAO, but it did change the scenario. So why is food classification so critical? Because it impacts other dietary guidelines, as this one that was published on December 6, 2016 by Uruguay, because it impacts not only the dietary guidelines in the region, but also public policies and labeling regulations. So this is the Uruguayan dietary guideline, which reproduces the Brazilian one, avoid the consumption of ultra-processed foods. And for the first time, take a look at this. This is very interesting. They put pictures of what is to be classified as a natural, processed, and ultra-processed foods. So a long list of food additives implies this is an ultra-processed food in the many, many categories. So you have here dairy products. You can also see here, for instance, in cereal products. If your list of ingredients is long, then your product is ultra-processed. So Peru copied the same idea, also did Ecuador, and as you can see, it says there, avoid, and it implies it should bear a warning label, which in Ecuador is different. And then even in Canada, they talk about highly processed foods instead of ultra-processed food. But they are cautious in a way, limit the consumption, and just it's a recommendation, limit the consumption of highly processed foods. And then lately, August 1st, so a week ago, Colombia published the nutritional guidelines for the Colombian population based on biodiversity and real food. And here you have the real food concept. So this is how a guy in Spain who invented the real food concept has been able to promote his idea to a dietary guideline. I wish you can read the document because it is very, very different. So it values the work of a woman, it values home cooking and traditional cooking, and it despises industrial products. So here we have the last published dietary guideline in Latin America, and of course here is my time to remind you that the overall and most important entity in the world that decides on the regulations and of all food products, the Codex Alimentarius, which is an entity that depends on FAO and WHO, defines food and defines food additives. And food is anything that can be used as a food, not only the food, but the ingredients and anything contained in the food. And I will not read the classification. And food additives are clearly defined as substances that are used for a technological purpose. So when we talk about foods containing food additives and being converted into ultra-processed foods in a minute, we are forgetting that actually food additives used in the food industry and at home, because we all use a lot of food additives in our kitchens also, are keenly reviewed and are accepted and approved by the most important entity in the world. So nothing in a food is dangerous for our health because it has been approved by a set of entities around the world for our knowledge and support. So starting in 2016, and I'm only showing 2022 here, a lot of regulations were adopted by Latin American countries. The first country to adopt a warning label regulation was Chile in June of 2016. So that was 9 years ago. And followed by Peru and Argentina later, and Uruguay, Brazil, with a different type of drawing or design, also Colombia, Mexico, etc. In 2024, Colombia changed from the little round figures that Israel had adopted to warning labels, that's octagons too, and implanted contains low-calorie sweeteners logo also. Argentina and Mexico are the ones who mandate the use of warning sentences. It contains sweeteners not recommended for children. It contains caffeine, avoid in children. And they also use the nutrient model by PAHO, and that makes a large difference that we will discuss. Okay, a week ago, Jamaica adopted also the warning labels in Central America. Just take into consideration that Central America does not even have, as of today, a regulation for nutritional labeling, so they don't have the chart that we all have, okay? But they are imposing now a front-of-pack labeling. So Codex is the main entity around the world, right? And Codex has also decided on guidelines, on concepts that should be complied in order to make a good front-of-pack labeling. And it's called the front-of-pack nutrition labeling, should be applied to a food in a manner consistent with the corresponding nutrient declaration of that food. Which means that if a product is low in sugar, it has 2 grams of sugar on the table, then it would show nothing on the front of pack because no high sugar should exist in a package that has a low sugar content. Okay, what happened in Chile? Chile has a set of parameters that was decided when the law came into force. High in calories is over 275 calories, and that was chosen by the committee. There's no reason for that. It was a you know, a number that was chosen. But if you see the sodium, the total sugars, and the saturated fat, you see it's more or less 1/5 of the amount that should be eaten in a day. So for instance, let's take saturated fat. It is 4. And the amount that should be eaten, according to Codex, is 20 grams of saturated fat, the most per day for an adult. So the same goes for sodium, which is 2,000 milligrams a day. Okay, so knowing the parameters, the problem in Chile is that only the foods that have been added with salt, sugar, or fats need to bear the warning. So here you have the picture of 2 butters. The butter with salt says high in saturated fat and high in calories. The butter without salt doesn't show anything. So for a lady who goes to the supermarket, the housewife goes to the supermarket, and she will buy the unsalted butter because it's not high in fat for her, right? So this is a big problem. Now you'll see why Chile is so fat now. The same thing goes for cream and processed cheese and Reggiano cheese. So the Reggiano cheese is only high in salt in Chile, no high in fat, not in saturated fat. Cream doesn't have a warning label. And processed cheese, because it is a mixture of different ingredients, does have the labels. Now take a look at this one. When the cream is only cream, the only ingredient is cream and has not been added with anything else, but it contains 17 grams of saturated fat per 100 grams. And if you take the one that is culinary, that's sold in 1 liter and goes also to the restaurants, because it has been added with skim milk, then it will bear the 2 warning signs. Now take a look at anybody trying to decide what to buy in a supermarket. Of course, people would buy the ones that have no labels, because on top of this, the government used a marketing sentence: choose the foods with less warning labels. It is a lot better if they don't have any. So it enticed the people to buy foods without warning labels. But the information was wrong in many of them. Now, a report by UNICEF from 2022 shows that Chile is the most obese country in Latin America. And children under 5 are really obese. And this is a big problem. Now, the problem is, why is this so if warning labels were supposed to be efficient, right? We're supposed to teach the people. Well, this is the last published paper by the authors of the NOVA system. And it shows that countries like Chile, Brazil, Mexico, they don't consume more, they don't even reach 30% of their total calories in a day that come from ultra-processed foods. So how about the 70% of calories that come from the culinary products, the home cooking and the restaurant and the schools? Maybe that's the problem, right? Maybe that's why the Chilean population is so fat. So this has to be taken into account, because in our countries in Latin America, not even in Brazil, the consumption of ultra-processed foods goes over 30%. So we still eat at home, and we are growing fatter and fatter. Now let's go to Mexico with a regulation that has imposed different 5 warning labels, 2 warning sentences, and a very curious way of labeling small portions like small chocolate products. They have to bear a number, and the number shows the number of warning labels it should have had if the package was bigger. Please explain to me how a consumer is supposed to understand this. Okay, so here again, in Mexico, they use the PAHO profile model. Now the problem is, the labels that are determined by 100 grams or 100 milliliters, which are excess calories and excess sodium, give the correct information. But when a warning label is determined with respect to the product's total calorie content, then the information in the front or back is flawed, is wrong. For instance, there is no percentage of grams of sodium or grams of sugars in 100 grams or 100 milliliters of a food or a beverage, because it depends on the caloric content. So it's calorie that has been given to the product by the presence of sugars divided the calories in 100 grams. You don't even need the 100 grams. It's calories given by a sugar to the product divided the calories of the product. So if the product has very low calories and a very low content of sugar, then you get to this sample. This broccoli soup has 2.5 grams of sugar in 100 milliliters of the soup, but the soup in 100 milliliters only has 73 calories. So when you do the math, the calories of 2.5 grams of sugar times 4, right? Because 4 is calories in the sugar. Divided the calories in the soup, it turns out it is a product that has to bear an excess sugar warning when 2.5 grams of sugar is low in all the countries in the world, including the European community, right? So this is absurd. People do not believe what they see because the information they see in Mexico, Argentina, and also in Colombia is fake, is wrong. It does not represent, as Codex said, the same information that is seen on the back of the package. So this is the situation in these 3 countries. It will be the same situation also in Jamaica starting soon. In Argentina, we use packages that are green or light blue to indicate light products, reduced in fat, reduced in sugar, and red for a full calorie product. If you see the table down below, you can see the amounts of fats that are present in each package. Because of this caloric relationship, the ratio of the calories from the fat divided the calories of the product, these products are wrongly labeled, and of course, a housewife will buy the red product. So the consumer are induced to buy the wrong product, the product with more calories and more fat. And reformulation is hindered also, because why would you reformulate if when you lower the fat or lower the sugar, you get more warning signs that you get for the full fat or the full sugar product? So industry is tied to the fact that reformulation is not convenient. Also, look at this product. This is a very funny product. It is a yogurt with no salt added. Of course, the sodium comes from the milk. But because it is a low-fat yogurt, it is a light yogurt, and is sweetened with a non-caloric sweetener, it bears a warning for the non-caloric sweetener and an excess sodium warning label on the front and back. An excess sodium for a product which has not been added with sodium. So also in our countries, reformulation for sugar products is difficult because a warning sign is mandatory for low and no calorie sweeteners. Another problem is schools. You know, in Latin America, when you have a warning label, your product cannot be sold to the school system. So kids are not eating yogurt because they all have warning labels, most of them, or you know, regular cookies, but they are served the same type of cookies by the school canteen, made by the owner of the school canteen with no food safety around it or anything. So this is a problem. Okay, we all should know that there has been a historical transformation from basic cooking to advanced food technology. This is as simple as advancement of science. I mean, we have actually moved from cooking to industrialized products, and that's science in motion. We, the food scientists, have done this. We have improved the formulations. We have made food available, safe, nutrition, and affordable. And a good paper to read is this by Aguilera, which shows this progression from traditional home cooking to industrialized products. So we have to give it an end to the discussion, okay? It's time for us to, make science understood. It's time for the food scientists to stand up and speak, because this is hurting the world. I mean, we're penalizing foods that are perfectly safe, perfectly affordable, perfectly nutritious, and we are making people decide whether to buy a food that is packaged or make it at home. So, okay, we spoke about the consumption of the so-called ultra-processed foods in countries, and this is the last publication, the last paper by the Nupens group. And if you see the way the obesity has increased, it has increased way over the consumption of ultra-processed foods by all sorts of different causes, because obesity is a multifactorial disease. And you can also see that it has changed over the time, and that actually there has not been an impact, a favorable impact of the labeling in our countries. Just to mention a few, several entities around the world were clear about the fact that the NOVA system should not be used for nutritional advice. The first one to do that was the Spanish Agency for Food Safety and Nutrition, and they wrote a report that it's important to remember that one cannot attempt to relate the degree of processing with an effect on health independently of the composition of the food. And as you have seen, it's not about processing, because it is about the fact that only one additive or one food ingredient that you don't use in your home kitchen can make a product become an ultra-processed product. Also, the dietitians in UK were clear about the fact that the NOVA system should not be used for nutritional advice. And it is also important to recognize that processed foods and ultra-processed foods, as described by NOVA Category 4, are not necessarily high in fat, salt, and sugar, and other healthy and other less healthy additives. Processed and ultra-processed foods are not necessarily unhealthy to consume. Also, ANSES, the French authority, has made it clear that the classification is confusing and it should not be used for nutritional advice. In 2023, the 6th edition of the Nordic Nutrition Recommendations also pointed out that in addition, the NOVA classification of ultra-processed foods also includes many food products which are not associated with any apparent adverse health effect. So they all point out the uselessness of the classification for dietary recommendations. The Scientific Advisory Committee of Nutrition, which advises the government or the Office of Health, also made the same type of comments. And in the United States, the scientific report for the 2025 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee had initially mentioned exactly the same thing, that should not, the NOVA classification or the ultra-processed food concept was undefined and should not be used for dietary recommendations. With the new administration, and at the beginning of July, or by the end of July, I think it was July 25th, The ultra-processed food request for information form was published at the FDA website, and replies are supposed to be sent before September 23rd or 24th. So I would ask you all to send your comments into the FDA, because they are seeking a definition, thinking that a correct definition of ultra-processed foods will clear up the mess. Okay, I used the same example of Julie Hess, who works for the US Department of Agriculture, how to compose a dietary, a healthy pattern, a healthy diet using only ultra-processed food products. So I'll go over that. And I like to point out that it would be very nice if you were able to read this paper by Dr. Richard Mattis, professor of the University of Purdue and who worked all his life at the Manila Institute. And as you know, the criticism about NOVA and ultra-processed foods that comes from food science is that actually those associations with adverse health effects show no mechanism at all. So why would a packaged bread have the same impact on health? You know, it's all lumped together. It's a big bag of different products that are called ultra-processed foods. And how do they relate to the adverse health effect? What is the mechanism? So this is a very good review to enlighten you of the fact that actually this group has reviewed all the possible potential mechanisms that would relate UPF to adverse health effects and has found no one to comply to this relation. So I'd like to offer you the new view of the IUFOST. The IUFOST is the International Union of Food Science and Technology, of which I am a proud fellow. There is a task force that has grouped a very prominent food scientists, and they have developed this new approach that takes into account the potential effects that cooking or roasting or high temperatures could have, for instance, on vitamins. And so it has studied the processing side for, you know, any potential decrease in vitamins in a product. That's the typical example because of heating. Thermolabel vitamins, and has also studied the formulation side. So for instance, when you go from an apple to an applesauce and you have added sugar in the processing, then how nutritious is that food after the thermal process and the addition of sugar? And what it will look like is this spider type diagrams that show other implications of the food, because it's not only about being nutritious, it's not only about the composition of the food, but also about affordability, the fact that the food is accepted, the fact that it is sustainable. So we all hope in 2 weeks from now, we will be presenting at the Paris Nutrition Congress, the Worldwide International Nutrition Congress of Paris, and we will be presenting this new approach that takes into account quantitative measures of processing and formulation. With this, I'd like to say the same thing, and I had not seen Thomas' presentation, that science relies on evidence that is not only compelling in itself, but also stands up to scrutiny and is accepted by the relevant scientific community. Scientific claims must be supported by evidence that is valid, accurate, reliable, and reproducible. And we all know the NOVA system does not meet this science criteria. But remember, it is difficult to make someone change their point of view because a long, long time ago, many centuries ago, the father of the scientific method, Francis Bacon, used this sentence: the human understanding, when it has once adopted an opinion, draws all things else to support and agree with it. And though there be a greater number and weight of instances to be found on the other side, yet this it either neglects and despises, or else by some distinction sets aside and rejects. So we have to do a lot of talking from now on to make sure science is understood. Thank you very much.
Obrigada, Susana. Obrigada, Thomas. Eu acredito que hoje a Sban está fazendo história, porque, apesar de eu ter dito que não existem coincidências, né, assim, foi uma grande, um grande encontro, assim, de nós termos conseguido o Thomas e a Susana presencialmente aqui no Brasil. E nós temos eu gostaria de convidar o Thomas e a Susana para sentarem aqui comigo. E a gente já tem algumas perguntas do chat, com o pessoal falando bastante, agradecendo também o nosso evento. E para quem tiver pergunta aí, por favor, fazer em português, ok? Thomas, come here. Okay. Bom, okay, tem uma pergunta do chat do Holger Toschka. Ele pergunta qual seria a razão para cientistas bem treinados, especialmente nas ciências médicas, considerando a classificação, cada vez mais considerar a classificação nova como comprovada e desenvolverem suas próprias pesquisas com base nessa falsa suposição, para os dois. Sim.
Okay, so can I reply in English?
Yeah. Take the microphone.
So I will reply to this question in English. Is it on? Yeah, it is on. Well, it's difficult to say this, but we should all be aware that nutrition science should involve food science in the universities. And the truth is, unless in my country and several other countries that I've visited, food science and food technology are not taught in medicine schools. So food composition and food technology and the advancement of science in the last 80 years has not been taught correctly or has not even been taught. So the concepts of formulating a food product, food additives, food ingredients, industrial ingredients are not known by the medical community. So this is my opinion, and everything that I say is my opinion, that the NOVA system is, as I've heard many people say, it is simple. It is simple, but it's completely wrong. It is simple, so for people who know nothing about food science and technology, hearing that everything that is made by an industry and packaged is wrong for you and for your health, it's simple. It's like a simple advice. And I think the importance of it is that people think of potato chips and sugary beverages when they think of ultra-processed foods as a standard product. You know, we all know sugary drinks should be eaten with moderation, because moderation and variety are the only secrets to a good diet. But, you know, that's my thought. So being simple, and I want to say something that I hardly ever say science existed 100 years ago, 200 years ago. I'm a chemist by profession. I'm a doctor in chemistry, and chemistry started 200 years ago. And food science started also 200 years ago, in 1812 to be exact. So a new classification 15 years ago, where does it come from? We don't need it. You see, we all know what a processed food is. We know the FDA regulations of processed foods. And foods are divided in nature foods by Codex and processed foods. And that's it, with the intervention of man or not. So a potato is a in nature food, a tomato. But if a tomato is packaged, it's a processed food. So that's it. Thank you.
And você?
Yeah, if I may add very briefly, I can totally agree with you that food chemistry and in particular natural sciences do not play the important role in the education of during medicine studies. So that's my point of view. But I would add another point. According to my experience, I know many colleagues from medicine, from nutrition science, who know and also realize that the NOVA system is flawed. But nevertheless, they use it because they say, how say in English, I just checked it, the end justifies the means. So they use it in order to, let's say, educate the consumer, knowing that the system is flawed, but hoping that at the end something positive arises. And this is something, of course, as a scientist, I cannot accept to base a, let's say, nutritional education on a scientifically flawed system. But many of those guys I talk with know this, but they still say, okay, if we reach something, if we have an effect in order to decrease the obesity or whatever, then we use whatever system we have. And this is one of the major problems for me, to base a nutritional education on a scientifically flawed system.
Ok, thank you. Susana, o Holger também ele pergunta para você, quais foram as mudanças nos indicadores de saúde no Chile desde a introdução dos selos?
Well, this is a very sad case, very sad. Chile has a growing obese and overweight population, and it increases every year. It's getting worse and worse. And inactivity is rising also. Chilean boys and girls do not get the minimum 60 minutes a week of physical education in schools, and it has diminished over time, and now it's critical. And as you all know, Chile and all the Latin American countries are not safe, so kids do not walk to school anymore. And you can read all that in the actual UNICEF report that I show you. The aim of the regulation, the Black Science or Black Octagons regulation, was to try to curb the problem. As I showed you also, it has some biases, like the information is not correct in many of the cases, so it has not solved the information problem. It is true that in Chile, as everywhere else, no one turns around the package, or many people do not turn around and read the actual information in the nutrition facts table. And so it was thought to be an easier way to communicate the concentration of the important nutrients in the front of pack. It turns out that the beginning, there was a decrease in the purchases of dairy desserts and sugary beverages, but after a few months, it came back to the original levels. And it hasn't been successful because of the results we see. But it's also very important to notice that it is impossible to ask a system that it's imposed in only 30% of the calories that people eat to be responsible for the solution of the obesity problem in Chile. What they have to do is educate. You know, you cannot expect 30% of the, supermarket products are labeled. What about the other 70%? And the beverages, the home cooking, and everything that we know, the fried foods that are sold in Chile. We all know sopaipillos are sold when you leave the school, you have street food all over Chile. The same here in Brazil, the same in Mexico. We don't see that in Argentina because, it's not allowed, only in well-organized Sunday fairs, but except for that, very few street foods. But Chile does have that, so they have to educate the population. That's the only hope they have.
Ok. O professor Steven Hansey, que é querido aqui, né, para nós, ele não faz uma pergunta, mas ele diz que nós devemos usar cada vez menos a palavra ultraprocessado. Podemos falar como classificação nova, porque cada vez que a gente fala a palavra, a gente está dando mais espaço para um termo que não tem validade. Ok? E tem mais uma aqui para os dois também. Pessoas alinhadas com a narrativa dos ultraprocessados, né, de acordo com a nova, dizem que as nossas críticas aos ultraprocessados se baseiam na busca por produtos bons e saudáveis entre milhares de ultraprocessados ruins e menos saudáveis. Elas dizem que a nossa busca diminui a importância de ensinar aos consumidores o que devem comer. O que vocês acham disso?
Maybe I didn't understand the question completely, but I think it was about how to teach the consumer and how to, let's say, have an effort besides UPF. Was this correct?
I can repeat. Ok, vou falar em português. Ele está perguntando se as pessoas que criticam a nova, como nós, sempre damos exemplos de a gente busca alimentos saudáveis dentro dos ultraprocessados para explicar que essa classificação é inválida, mas que existem milhares de ultraprocessados ruins aqui na ideia dessa pessoa e que isso prejudica a forma como se ensina o consumidor a comer. Que as pessoas que criticam a classificação nova ficam pensando alimentos nutritivos para dar exemplo de como essa classificação está errada.
Okay, now I understand, I think. So, as I criticize, or many of us criticize NOVA, but of course we know that within this UPF class 4, several food items are included which are nutritionally not balanced. I would not say unhealthy, of course, because as mentioned before, there is no such thing than healthy or unhealthy food. But of course, within this class 4, several food items are included which I should say you should not consume too much. For instance, sweetened beverages, high salted foods, foods with high fat content. So nobody of us doubts that UPF food, or this NOVA class 4, I want to avoid UPF, NOVA class 4 contains foods which are nutritionally not so good, okay? But the problem is that if we look at this number of foods in detail, we will find that only a handful of these foods should be really, I should say, avoided or consumed in lower amounts. And nobody, definitely nobody who criticizes NOVA says that eat and drink whatever you want. Of course, there are food items in this group which should be limited. The sugar content should be limited, the intake of salt should be limited. Everybody of us accepts this. But to conclude from single examples to a whole group of food is not correct. And this is scientifically not justified.
I'd like to add, okay, as I said, the UPF NOVA 4 category is a bucket where everything that has one ingredient which is not found in your kitchen or one food additive, something that the NOVA system has invented is the fact that There are some cosmetic additives that tend to hide a bad product, and that is forbidden by codex, so no one in the industry will ever use an additive to hide a bad attribute of a food. That is specifically, explicitly prohibited. And food additives are only used when they are necessary to you know, for a functionality point of view, to add some consistency, to make the food more appealing, or many times in order to be able to standardize the lots of production, because not all tomatoes during the year have the same red color, so red coloring is used to standardize the color of a product, for instance, but never to hide a bad attribute. So the importance here is that also eat minimally processed foods is not a valid concept either, because you cannot eat as much red meat as you wish or poultry as you wish, because that is derogatory for your health. So we cannot, allow wrong concepts to be sent to the population with easy sentences, because eating is complicated. Education is the main way to teach someone to eat. Eat a variety of foods in moderation always. You can have a sugary beverage once a week or in a birthday party. Don't drink, sugary beverage, or don't eat cakes every day, even if they are made at home, because this is like a romance, Foods made at home are far better. Restaurant foods are better. That is not true. I mean, we should balance what we eat. We eat in moderation, even barbecues. We cannot eat meat in excess. And variety is moderation is the mantra for teaching people, not avoid ultra-processed foods, because the classification is simply wrong. From the start, from 2009 on, it has become even worse, because it started out as a processing classification, which of course it is not. There's nothing in the processing that has to do with a NOVA category 1, 2, maybe the one I take it is not processed food, what we would call tomato and strawberry or meat. But all the rest is processed foods, even the culinary ingredients, for God's sake. I mean, how can you recommend to eat lard in category 2 or butter? I mean, it is wrong. It is not good for nutritional advice, and we have nothing against the people who believe NOVA is okay. We just want to explain our point of view in order to help the people communicate in a better way to make people less sick. And the fact that it has not done any good so far shows that it should be changed, right? We need to start speaking the truth.
Ok, thank you, Susana. Eu tenho uma pergunta minha para a Susana e para o Thomas também, acho que mais para a Susana. Eu gostaria de saber, Susana, porque a nova, ela começou com categoria, né, de nível de processamento, depois ela passou para número de ingredientes, e agora o marcador para saber se um produto é ultraprocessado ou não é se ele tem a presença de pelo menos um aditivo alimentar. A gente sabe que todos os aditivos alimentares usados em produtos industrializados são comprovados e aprovados como seguro pelo JEC e Códex Alimentário. Eu gostaria de saber por que até hoje esses organismos não se pronunciaram, porque eu entendo que a nova ela vai contra a definição de segurança de aditivo alimentar, porque quando ela diz que se um alimento industrializado que passou por uma fábrica e tem um aditivo alimentar, né? Essa é a diferença entre um alimento que eles dizem de verdade e de mentira. O de mentira tem aditivo alimentar, o de verdade não, porque até hoje esses organismos não se pronunciaram em relação à segurança dos aditivos alimentares.
Thank you for the question. It allows me to explain something that I love to explain. And two aspects of this. We all use food additives in the kitchen. When we use eggs for a batter, for a flan, or for a cake, we're using lecithin, which is within the egg. We use citric acid every day of our lives when we cook a chicken because we add lemon to the chicken, and that's a food additive. We use vinegar in many of our preparations, and vinegar is a food additive. So we all use food additives, and that is just mainly ignorance. You know, people do not know that they live surrounded by food additives in the kitchen. The situation regarding why, you know, entities like regulatory entities do not speak up, I think comes from the fact that regulations come from a group, and dietary guidelines are written by another group in the Ministry of Health. The same thing happens in WHO and FAO because there are like two sets of people, the food scientists, the food safety people, that's us, and the nutrition science people who have lesser knowledge of chemistry and regulations. And some of them, believe it or not, are not aware of the fact that all the food additives that we use in industrialized foods are approved and are inspected by a risk assessment by the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives, which is an entity of FAO and WHO. So speaking against food additives is actually going against all the regulations that we have in our countries, because every food that is out there in the supermarket shelf has been approved by the authorities. Maybe in Brazil you do not have a pre-market approval of all the foods, only the foods that go through the Ministry of Agriculture. But in Argentina, in Colombia, in Uruguay, for instance, you cannot launch a food unless the Ministry of Health inspects it. So it is a safe food. And as Thomas says, there are not good and bad foods. There are good and bad diets. Because you can have a very bad food as a barbecue, a meat barbecue, or a chorizo, like we eat, but you can have one a month, you see? So that's the concept. There are no good and bad foods. There are only good and bad diets. And every food can be part of a diet when it's eaten in moderation. So that's my idea.
Okay. Thomas, do you want to say?
Yeah, only briefly, because Susana has mentioned everything. I think this fear for using additives results from a great mistrust in the authorities, you know, because at least for Europe, I can say the EFSA, European Food Safety Authority, or the Federal Institute for Risk Assessment, which does this job in Germany, their job is not to recommend the use of additives, or their job is not to recommend to use certain diets. Their job is to approve or disapprove food additives. And as long as a food additive is approved, it is safe. Otherwise, it would not be approved. So this is as simple as that, because we trust in our authorities. But those people who try to, let's say, use this phrase of nature against artificial, for them, of course, a additive always is per se something artificial, and then they base this on the skepticism of consumers. Oh, can we really trust the authorities? And then you create a corresponding narrative, meaning that artificial is not good, additives are per se artificial, and therefore they are unhealthy because we do not trust the authorities. So this is the basic problem, and everything which is then dealing with this nature versus which is not nature. Nature versus industry is based on this skepticism of many, many people against the authorities and against the industry.
Okay. Bom, agora espaço para a plateia. Quem tem pergunta, por favor, fala só, pode levantar, né, para a pessoa te ver, e falar de onde você é e seu nome, em português.
Bom dia, eu sou o Paulo, do Descascando a Ciência, um canal de divulgação científica, mas eu sou pesquisador também, então tenho toda uma carreira acadêmica aí e faço esse trabalho de conectar a sociedade com a ciência. Eu tenho algumas questões. Eu acho que um acerto do guia alimentar e dos selos de alta gordura, alto teor de sal, que eles fizeram, o acerto foi simplificar a informação. Então, isso torna palatável para a sociedade identificar algumas informações ali, né? E hoje a sociedade ela busca muita informação, ela quer saber o que ela está escolhendo, né? Então, ao meu ver, eu acho difícil a gente retroceder nessa questão de marcar os alimentos, né? Eu queria saber se vocês têm essa mesma visão, se vocês acham que é possível retroceder ou não. E aí, eu queria uma ajuda aí nessa parte de divulgação também, que ideia que vocês têm de uma estratégia de realmente simplificar alguma informação disso, de explicar melhor para que a pessoa possa ver essa informação no mercado, que não esteja tão errada. Concordo com tudo que vocês falaram aqui nas palestras, entendo perfeitamente isso. Mas a minha questão é, se vocês têm uma visão que se é possível retroceder, e caso não, se existe alguma ideia, alguma estratégia para a gente realmente criar alguma coisa para realmente informar melhor essas pessoas de forma simples, que é o que eles estão fazendo de uma forma errada. Obrigado.
Thank you for your question. I did not understand. I want to first make certain that you know that the Brazilian regulation is correct. The front-of-pack regulation of Brazil is correct, and it is based on the information for certain levels which are surpassed. When they are surpassed, then you have to point out on the front of pack that you have more than 10 or 15% of sugars in your product. So Brazil is the perfect example of a good front of pack regulation. Maybe what you wanted to ask was how can you explain people easily about the food they have in the package when they read the list of ingredients? That's what you meant?
O meu ponto é, quando as pessoas veem esse selo, elas logo associam ao ultraprocessado, e isso é uma informação ruim, entendeu? Então, esse é o meu ponto.
Okay. So first thing we need to teach the public in our blogs, in our journals, in our publications, in our conversations, is every food additive that you have in the list of ingredients is included in the general list of food additives of Codex Alimentarius. You can access the general list of food additives. It's called the General Standard for Food Additives, GSFA. You write GSFA, Codex Alimentarius, in Google, and you will get the list of all additives that are permitted in every category of foods. And according to Codex, foods are dairy products, meat products, vegetables and fruits, sugary products, and those are the food categories, the ones listed in Codex. So first thing, teach the people, all the additives are listed in the Codex Alimentarius, have undergone an inspection, and are proven safe. And the fact that we know that foods is industrialized has helped feed the world. We, the food scientists, have helped feed the world. People died in 1910 at the age of 50. Now people die at the age of 80. That's not only because of drugs and medicines, it is because food is affordable. And we have made food affordable by extending food shelf life. Why? Because we process foods that are rotten in the field, like tomatoes when they grow, and we have been able to produce tomato sauce that is stable for a year. Okay, so teach the people that we have contributed to saving the world. and we will continue to save the world. We are expected to be 10 billion people by 2050. How will you feed people in the world with food that is homemade in populations that do not know how to cook, where people like me travel and do not feed their families at home because the women force, labor force, has increased everywhere in the world. So you can check the statistics for women labor and see that women work just like men or even more. And of course, we are thankful of the food science and the food technology for allowing us to feed our children with lesser homework.
Okay. Thomas, could you?
Yeah, very briefly. I think this is a very important question. And I understood the question in that way, that we should think about going steps back in terms of thinking about what to label on the food and what not. And I would like to raise a very, let's say, maybe even extremistic position. Why do we need food labeling at all? Of course, we need some information about the contents of the ingredients, protein, fat, and so on. But why do we need any warning signs? Why do we need any high in this or low in that or red, yellow, and green or so? I think this is even more confusing because all of these concepts are from a scientific point of view flawed. All of this. Even this in Germany, what I showed you, the Nutri-Score, which has some kind of a calculation basis, has also extreme limitations. So let's think about the fact, why do we need this at all? And what does it really help for the consumer? Who asks the consumers what they really want? If we check in Germany, there are studies with preschool kids having an age of about 5 to 6. They cannot read, but they showed them pictures of food and of different foods, hamburgers, Coca-Cola, salad, whatever. And they should arrange the foods in healthy and not healthy. And all of these kids were able to distinguish between healthy and not healthy food. So the education obviously worked. I think everybody knows what is better for the diet and what is not better. Everybody knows that fat-containing foods, we should not eat too much fat-containing foods. Everybody knows this. So why do we even need corresponding warning labels? Let us better think about, and this is, I know this is a topic which is highly debatable, but let's better think about alternative concepts. Let's say a more educated approach, a more relaxed approach. So why do we have so many rules related to foods? Every rule creates the approach to break the rule, okay? Why do we have foods which are called a sweet sin? Yeah, we eat chocolate because it is a sin. So we always appeal to our cultural heritage, to somewhat religious attitudes even. So I would encourage us as food scientists and as nutrition scientists to think about the question, shouldn't we start to think about more basic things in terms of food education, nutrition education, discuss about why do we have so many rules, and would it be helpful to have a more, let's say, relaxed, I don't know whether I expressed really what I think, but maybe you understand what I mean, a more relaxed approach towards food and nutrition right at the beginning. And I think we would solve much more problems than any food labeling will ever do.
Eu tenho comentário para fazer para você, que eu acho que uma forma de você comunicar bem é que porque a nova, ela diferencia a origem do alimento. Se o alimento sai da fábrica, ele pode ser ruim, né? Na maioria das vezes ele é ruim para a nova, mas o alimento feito em casa não. Então é importante explicar que eu sempre dou esse exemplo: pastel de feira, garapa, coxinha da padaria, restaurante self-service, todos os alimentos que são feitos e produzidos até em escala industrial, porque tem redes de restaurantes e tudo, N redes aqui, a gente tem várias, eles não têm selo porque eles não saem de uma fábrica e não têm uma embalagem. Então, eu acho que a gente tem que explicar, porque existe uma noção de que as pessoas, em geral, elas preferem muita tecnologia, né? A gente gosta de ter o carro moderno, o telefone moderno, mas quando se fala de comida é uma coisa diferente. né? Então, a gente tem que mostrar que a comida tecnológica ela é boa para o mundo, como a Susana disse, ela é sustentável, ela é mais barata, ela vai ser mais gostosa, por quê? Os diferenciais, os fatores que fazem uma pessoa consumir um alimento é o gosto, o preço e a acessibilidade. Tá? Então, não adianta eu fazer alguma coisa que não seja bom, que você não vai comer. Se for caro, não vou comprar. Entendeu? E se for difícil de buscar, também não vou. Então, a gente não pode ignorar isso. Assim, quando a Susana fala, eu vou falar uma frase muito dura, sou nutricionista, mas quando se fala em educação nutricional, não acredito tanto nisso, porque se a educação nutricional fosse a razão das pessoas estarem comendo mal, não haveriam nutricionistas fora do peso, e eu sou prova disso, viva. Tá? Estou acima do meu peso. Então, a gente tem que lembrar que a Susana disse que no Chile é 30% dos alimentos industrializados. No Brasil, são 20%. Então, como é que a gente pode colocar 20% de 100 como responsável por doenças crônicas não transmissíveis ou até morte precoce? Então, a gente tem que pensar que, porque muita gente me pergunta, Márcia, esse alimento dá câncer? Esse alimento faz mal? Adoçante, eu trabalho muito com adoçante. Esse adoçante dá câncer? Não, não dá. Todo alimento industrializado é seguro para consumo. Isso tem que ser um mantra. Isso tem que ser um mantra. Todo alimento industrializado, ele é seguro para consumo. Eu não sei se você sabe, houve um caso de botulismo há 2, 3 anos atrás em Brasília. Uma pessoa que comprou um pesto, uma mulher, uma funcionária pública, comprou um pesto, e ela tem botulismo. Ela teve botulismo e ela tem sequelas até hoje. Numa feira artesanal, o coitado do moço lá não soube preparar o produtinho dela. Então, a gente tem que mostrar que natural não é mais seguro que artificial, muito ao contrário, né? E não existe alimento de verdade ou alimento de mentira. E não existem alimentos bons e alimentos ruins, como a gente disse aqui, mas existem dietas desequilibradas. Tem mais uma pergunta, não tem?
Bom dia, me ouvem? Sou o professor Julian Martinez, da Faculdade de Engenharia de Alimentos da Unicamp. Então, obrigado, parabéns pelas apresentações. Eu queria fazer primeiro um pequeno comentário e depois minha pergunta. No comentário em relação à questão da ideologia, né, eu vi a abordagem do professor Thomas em relação a isso, e eu concordo plenamente, mas eu queria acrescentar que o próprio criador do termo, professor Monteiro, ele não nega que existe um caráter ideológico na classificação. Ele deu uma entrevista recentemente num programa de televisão em que ele literalmente disse que existe um aspecto ideológico na classificação. Então, até que ponto dizer isso é algo que confronte o termo, eu não sei. Tá? Então, eles assumem isso tranquilamente. A minha questão, tá, que é uma angústia, que é assim, a gente vê aqui inúmeros argumentos que deixam claro que a classificação nova é falha cientificamente. Eu acho que provavelmente estamos quase todos aqui de acordo em relação a isso. Felizmente, a gente está vendo que no meio científico isto começa a vir à tona. Tá? Alguns trabalhos que foram mostrados aqui mostram que a definição, especialmente dos ultraprocessados, ela é problemática, ela é falha, ela não pode ser usada, etc. O que me desespera é que, embora isso no meio científico esteja começando a mudar, na mídia não. Eu fico angustiado porque todos os dias, quando eu abro um site de notícias, tem alguma reportagem dizendo ultraprocessados causam X, ou Y, ou Z. Então, a minha pergunta, que eu já fiz algumas vezes e nunca me convenceram, é como nós podemos ir além da nossa bolha científica, tá? E conseguir comunicar para o grande público o que nós aqui estamos praticamente de acordo, para mudar essa percepção, que eu sinto que é uma percepção hoje popular, é midiática, tá viralizada, de que existem ultraprocessados e eles são os grandes vilões da alimentação. Então, a minha pergunta é como a gente faz para furar a bolha e começar a virar esse jogo.
Só para complementar, a Beatriz Crossati, também do online, faz a mesma pergunta, porque ela diz que cada vez mais ela vê mais conceitos errados, filmes, posts, falando tudo que vem numa garrafa ou embalado não deveria ser consumido porque é considerado um ultraprocessado. Como mudar isso?
Shall I go ahead? Well, thank you again. Sorry I have to speak in English, but it's just important for Thomas to understand. We have to speak up. For many, many years, I was very surprised. I started speaking up the moment I saw the first publication by the group, the Nupens group. And I was very shocked to see people in Brazil didn't speak up. We had a tour. It was called The Science Behind Food Regulations. And we had a tour in Chile, Argentina, and Brazil. We came to the University of São Paulo and invited the people at the Nupens group to discuss this issue. They never came. Okay, we know the group is not willing to discuss with food scientists. We have invited them several times in scientific events. So we are the ones to speak up. Every day, we should write an article, talk to the press, talk to the media. Ultra-processed foods, it's a buzzword. It sounds nice. It's like ultra, something magic is there. It's like some strange made-up word because they actually invented the word, looking, how can we call this that I think are foods that are bad for people because they are made at a factory. So it has become very nice to use in the media publications and on televisions. And the food industry is to blame for every problem that pertains to food and nutrition. But the fact is, in Brazil, only 20% of all the foods you eat are packaged. All the rest are feijoada, and feijoada is only eaten on Wednesdays and Saturdays, right? Or Wednesdays and Sundays, because it's not that good for you. You shouldn't be eating that every day, right? So moderation and variety. So speak up. Speak of moderation and variety, the safety of food additives, the fact that food science has been able to feed the world, that we would be starving if we didn't have the food industry by now. Speak of the lifespan in the beginning of the century, of the past century and now. Speak about fortified foods. That's one aspect that we forget. In the nutrition meeting in Paris in 2 weeks, we will be speaking of the importance of fortified foods for the unnourished people in Africa. People in Bangladesh and in the South Asia cannot afford food, and they are provided with fortified foods. The children are. So fortified foods are classified as ultra-processed foods.
They're roofed.
And fortified foods are so important for other parts of the world, not Brazil, where you spit a seed and you get a plant. But people in other parts of the world, in Africa and in countries that cannot afford to distribute foods and eat like countries in Africa where they only grow a certain kind of cereal, and that's all they get. They don't have diversified foods supply because they are far from roads, and those people exist. We feed them with fortified foods. And the foods that WHO and all these organizations, the UN, are foods made in a food plant, in an industry. They are fortified pouches of peanut butter, depending on the country, peanut butter with vitamins and minerals, or chickpeas butter for the Indian population. So fortifieds have been classified by UPF by the Nupens group. In what mind does that is possible? So talk. The only way of doing this is by the help of you all. Thomas talks, I talk, but I've been speaking for 16 years now, and I need help. So go, don't be shy, stand up and speak with your family, with your friends, to the press, to the media, to the television people. This is wrong, and it's hurting the planet. It's hurting the availability of foods because people despise, no, that's an industrialized food. That's bad for me. They force them to buy foods that are very expensive. You should read Adam Drunowski's work. He has spoken of food deserts in the United States of America. Oh, I'm sorry. Dr. Adam Drunowski, he speaks of food deserts. In North America, not everybody has access to fresh food. Fresh food is very expensive, and it's true. They buy in supermarkets in the areas. No, not fruits and vegetables available like here. And so try to read his work. Adam Drunowski, that's his work. His last name, and he will explain how important it is to trust what the factories make, because if not, you cannot buy food. There's no food around where you live. And so I'd like Thomas to add to this. Thomas?
Yeah, very briefly. First of all, thank you for the first comment concerning that the proponents of NOVA even accept that it is an ideology. And I can only say this to this end, as a German, I bear a special responsibility, given on our history, I must say, to ensure that natural sciences remain free of ideological influence. Because in Germany, from 1933 to 1945, we have seen what a misuse of natural sciences can bring with it falsehood, injustice, and profound human suffering. And therefore, we, as Germans, are raised in order to never again, okay? So this is my comment on the first part concerning the ideological aspect. And the second part, I don't know what to do. The ghost is out of the flask, so to say. But the only thing we can do is, and I couldn't agree more with Susana, use our own bubble, use our own surroundings, use our own colleagues, our pupils, our, let's say, possibilities to clearly show that this is not science, what it is. NOVA is not science. NOVA is an ideology, even the guys accept it. So try to talk science and try to educate the people, by the way, that we need a scientific basis when we talk about the influence of processing on food. So I have no real advice or so, because I'm not in a position to advise you here. But I think everybody of us can do a lot of things in his or her own, let's say, community. That's the only thing I could recommend.
Tem uma pergunta aqui do chat, da Magali Weber, é muito boa. Como podemos considerar as correlações encontradas em muitos estudos com relação aos efeitos nocivos à saúde? Correlação não é a causalidade, ela sabe disso, mas precisamos compartilhar uma classificação para comparar os resultados. Ela diz isso. O que vocês recomendariam para levar em consideração os multicritérios? About the observational.
Shall I start in this way? In this case, well, of course, it would be impossible to discuss all this huge number of individual studies here. But as mentioned in both of our studies, all of these studies show correlations and not causality. This is the basic of this. So these are observations, and we can take these observations into account for a scientific discussion. But all of these studies, if you look at them in detail, you can narrow this down, this NOVA class 4 related to whatever health aspect, you can narrow this down to the intake of certain highly fat or highly energy containing foods. And this is textbook knowledge. We know this since 30 or 40 years. So from that point of view, the number of studies is not an issue or not an indication for good science. It's not an indication for a profound explanation of a potential hypothesis. What we need is real controlled trials in order to prove whether the uptake of certain ultra-processed foods, and I want to avoid this phrase, of foods classified according to NOVA 4, have a certain negative impact. Such studies are extremely expensive. Such studies are very, how do you say, you need a lot of people to do this. And even for these studies, the results will be only minimal. So from that point of view, of course, all of these correlation studies have some evidence or so, have some things we can discuss, but they don't bring us real evidence in terms of causality. And from that point of view, my recommendation is what I mentioned in my talk. We should, as scientists, stop to classify food according to NOVA. We shouldn't use this phrase UPF. We can make studies based on high sugar containing beverages and their impact on whatever, or high fat containing foods and the impact on whatever. Clearly define the dietary composition, clearly define the nutrients and their effect on health outcomes, but not a classification on a ideology. From that point of view, for me, it's garbage in and garbage out. Yeah? Science based on invalid measures, I mentioned this in my talk, is invalid. I can't say more about this.
And just to add a concept, quite recently, Ciaranforde has shown in a study that is new, but the concept already existed, that eating rate and consistency of the food is very important for food intake. So the softer the food is, the faster we eat it. So the combination of eating rate and consistency shows that you eat most foods that are soft, you will eat more calories more quickly. So it is about eating rate, and consistency it's not about the processing or that we have to take into account. So just I repeat to the end from now on until you die, association does not show causation. So it's associated with doesn't mean anything, okay? And when you say this, the people who believe NOVA is right say, we wouldn't have been able to ban tobacco if we didn't have association studies. So as justifying, and they have said also UPF, ultra-processed foods, are the new story of the tobacco industry. You've heard that, right? No, it's not the same, because tobacco is bad for you in any amount, and food is good for you in moderation and variety. So it's not the same thing, and association studies don't show anything, so we have to see what the studies that are randomized and controlled say to us. And so far, they say you can lose weight eating both ultra-processed foods or minimally processed foods, and you have a new published paper about this that shows it clearly. So the science shows that it is not true that ultra-processed foods are the guilty foods and the cause of all illnesses in the world, because the association doesn't show cause, and because the definition of the food is wrong, so there are confusion situations when they choose what food to add to the study. They use data that was done 20 years ago when nobody knew what a classification NOVA was. So there are many mechanistic problems in those studies, even if they are 3,000. And if you take a close look, you'll see that most of them have been published by the same people.
Just a very brief addition to this. Susana mentioned that there are several studies now trying to show certain effects, or let's say certain correlations again, and explain why we eat certain foods more than the others. Honestly, I must say we are now in the situation that NOVA pushes the nutrition science in an area to perform studies to confirm what is usually known as common sense. Of course, we know that if a food tastes better, then we eat it more likely than the other one. If a food is better chewable, then we eat it more likely than the other one. If a food has more sugar in it, we prefer to eat it compared to food which has no sugar. So this is something, from me, if I find these studies, which are very important in order to defeat the science against NOVA. But what we observe at the moment is that we perform a lot of studies just to show what everybody really knows.
Ok. Só para complementar também, né, tabaco e álcool são drogas, né? Ingredientes alimentares, alimento é comida, né? E a FAO diz, if it's not safe, it's not food. Né? Se não é seguro, não é comida. Então, tabaco não tem quantidade de consumo, como a Susana disse, né? Em qualquer quantidade. E ainda tem uma informação nova que é muito triste. O Brasil voltou a aumentar os índices de consumo de tabaco. Então, apesar de toda a propaganda contra o fumo, apesar de toda a proibição de locais de fumo, apesar de tudo, hoje, com todas as propagandas, hoje nós temos um aumento do consumo de cigarro, aumento do tabaco, do uso do tabaco. Então, isso é para a gente refletir um pouquinho. Tem uma pergunta aqui. Você está com o microfone, Fernanda? Não? Tem uma pergunta aqui, que é de Elisa Stenner Dutra. É um pouquinho difícil. Ela diz assim: minha dúvida é sobre a ciência dessas substâncias, ela está falando dos aditivos, não sobre o produto em si. Eu vou ler exatamente o que ela escreveu. Tem mais de 40 substâncias que estão na lista de risco à saúde, como corantes artificiais, dióxido de titânio, BHT e BHA, farinha clareada. Alguns aditivos são, sim, necessários para engrossar, aumentar validade, melhorar sabor, enfim. Mas qual o limite para quantidades? Corantes, por exemplo, existem produtos que têm 3, 4 tipos de corantes. E aí, completando uma outra. Quais tipos de aditivos, corantes e adoçantes são, de fato, prejudiciais à saúde? Nenhum, mas eu vou continuar a pergunta. Além do tipo, qual a quantidade segura? Faltam estudos em relação a isso. Não faltam. E sobre o projeto de lei no Texas, que quer alertar sobre aditivos perigosos no Doritos e no M&M, podem receber o rótulo de não recomendados para humanos. Comentar.
Okay, I'm a regulatory expert, and I've worked in regulatory for at least 40 years. So I can reply to this question, and to make sure that the person asking this understands that there is a whole array of regulations for the approval of a new food additive. Let's say we want to approve stevia as a sweetener, non-caloric sweetener, stevia product. Okay. The company or the country where this company is established will receive a dossier of information with all the needed toxicological studies that are a huge amount of scientific studies that need to be in that dossier for the substance to be even approached to the committee of the Codex Committee of Food Additives in the country where the company resides. They receive a request by the company or the country to send this request to the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives to run this risk assessment of this new product. Okay, so who runs the studies, the toxicological studies, the cancer studies for 3 generations of laboratory animals, the studies, you know, a big list of studies that need to be run. The company who's asking its country to present this to the Codex Committee, local Codex Committee of Food Additives, let's say the United States. The local Codex Committee on Food Additives will be part of the World Codex Committee on Food Additives, and that's where they will introduce this request. Who pays for the studies to be done? The company wanting to approve the stevia sweetener. So it is needed, a lot of money is needed to run the studies, and that this can take years. When the dossier finally gets into the list of priorities of JECFA, the Joint Expert Committee of Food Additives, then it is for the group of scientists of all different sciences, nutrition sciences, toxicological sciences, chemists, and all the scientists you can think of, a group of more than 30, 40 people who are independent, are not paid, only their travel expenses are paid. These are individuals that are known because of their expertise in their fields, scientific fields, and they are the ones to review all the information that has been submitted. After a number of years, that can take, you know, several years, then you will have the final risk assessment done by JECFA. It is for the Codex Committee on Food Additives to then determine what food categories that stevia sweetener can be applied on. So you have a full set of scientists inspecting the substance and the information that has been sent in. And then you have the Codex Committee decide where this additive can be used. And it is for the JECFA to decide the maximum quantity that will be considered safe. And that's the famous ADI, which is the dose or the level of milligrams that a person can eat all the days during his whole life that is considered safe. And that's an amount that is 100 times lower than the amount at which no effect, no deleterious effect has been found in animals in the lab. So this acceptable daily intake amount is the amount that is accepted. And then when you go to the categories, the food categories, you will also find there a level of usage. So for instance, colorants, she's worried about the colorants. Colorants can be used in this amount in chewing gum, in this other amount in candies, in this other amount in beverages. So everything is studied in advance. There is no risk. If there were a risk, they wouldn't be used. So for the common people, in order to know whether something is safe or not, go to the Codex Standards of Food Additives in the Google it, and you'll find it there. Synthetic colorants are safe for use, and they are used in very slow amounts. The fact that the United States of America is now asking the industries to not use synthetic colorants anymore, and there are a few of them, is just a request. Several states have already banned the use of these colorants, but some others have not. So this is the story about the colorants. They wouldn't be listed in the Codex Alimentarius if they weren't safe. And certain countries have banned titanium dioxide. For instance, the European Union has decided not to use it anymore because of concerns, but the United States is using it, and all of Latin America. So re-evaluations are done over time, and now the Food Safety Authority of Europe, the EFSA, is currently reviewing a lot of food additives. Currently, a month ago, it was announced that acesulfame K, which is used as a sweetener in non-sugar added beverages and many foods, is so safe that they have doubled the ADI. So re-evaluation is the way to see if something new arises, and when a product is found that shouldn't be used anymore, it will be taken out from the Codex list of accepted food additives. So stay calm, do not worry in advance, nothing has happened yet, it's just a situation in the United States. So, oh, okay. Not recommended for humans. This is very important to convey to the consumers, because all these stories about harmful food additives, about the UPF concept, has made people very worried. And I see this in my family. You know, people who are not acquainted with the way food additives are evaluated are very, very worried, and they think they shouldn't be, for instance, taking low and no calorie sweeteners. The fact that PAHO has decided it should be pointed out as a critical nutrient has made a big problem for everybody in the diabetes field. Kids with diabetes have been told to eat gelatin with no sugar, right? So sugar-sweetened are forbidden. Sugar-sweetened beverages should not be taken by diabetic people. Now they are concerned about the fact that they shouldn't be eating any product that contains a low or no sugar sweetener. No sugar sweeteners are safe. They are safe all over the world. They have been, incorporated into national regulations in all of the countries, practically all of the countries in the world, with the exception of cyclamate in the United States, which was banned in 1969, not because it was dangerous, but because the United States has a clause that is called the Delaney clause that was passed by the Senate in the United States, that anything that could be suspected of even having a deleterious effect in humans should be banned. And that's how cyclamate was banned, because of a study, a scientific study that in mice that afterwards was proven wrong. But it was banned, and then aspartame showed up in the market, and then sucralose showed up in the market, and they never asked for a reevaluation of the cyclamate. So that's the only one that is banned in the United States. Thomas?
Olá, boa tarde. Eu sou Fernanda, eu trabalho na indústria de alimentos, mas de formação eu sou nutricionista, sou bióloga e tenho um mestrado em saúde pública. Eu primeiro parabenizo todos pelo evento, realmente excelentes apresentações. E acho que foi comentado aqui também como que a gente traduz isso para a população, né? Que é uma das grandes dificuldades que temos hoje. Como nutricionista, eu sempre penso em efetivamente como trazer essa mensagem final. Então, escutando tudo que foi falado hoje, eu listei aqui uns principais pontos e eu queria confirmar com vocês se esse meu pensamento está correto e se é nessa linha que a gente deve evoluir. Então, primeiro, foi dito que a definição de ultraprocessado ela é vaga e chega a ser não científica. Que os estudos que estão aí por trás do termo ultraprocessado, eles podem ser questionáveis, e gostei muito do que o Thomas falou, né, garbage in, garbage out, acho que esse é um ponto importante de pensar. A Susana muito bem agora colocou, os aditivos são seguros, então, acho que é o ponto importante, e o grande questionamento dos alimentos ultraprocessados, ele também passa pelo uso dos aditivos, então essa segurança, né, que a doutora Susana traz de que são seguros é importante. E também me chamou a atenção as apresentações que disseram que uma dieta baixa em alimentos ultraprocessados, ela não necessariamente é saudável, e, na verdade, uma dieta que tem majoritariamente alimentos ultraprocessados, como mostrado num artigo, ela pode ser, sim, saudável. Então, parece que esses argumentos deveriam ser suficientes para justificar uma orientação nutricional que não seja feita baseada em alimentos ultraprocessados. E aí eu penso de como que isso está sendo feito, né, ao redor do mundo. Então, aqui no Brasil e aqui na América Latina, a gente ouve muito que o Brasil e a América Latina foram pioneiros nessa recomendação de evitar ultraprocessados e que isso está sendo usado pelo resto do mundo. Mas também foi apresentado aqui que não necessariamente. Então, países como Espanha, países nórdicos, UK e, recentemente, a Alemanha, também publicaram guias alimentares ou orientações que não levam em consideração a definição de alimentos ultraprocessados, ou não fazem a recomendação de evitar alimentos ultraprocessados, que, na verdade, eles trabalham com conceitos antigos e que me pareciam que com muita ciência por trás, que eram por grupos de alimentos. Então, a gente tinha as pirâmides alimentares, os pratos, né, no Reino Unido, por exemplo. Então, o que está me parecendo, e aí eu queria a confirmação de vocês e o comentário de vocês, é que, na verdade, essas orientações por grupos de alimentos parecem que têm mais ciência do que essa orientação ou esse caminho novo que se tentado trazer, que seria de evitar alimentos ultraprocessados. Então, eu queria saber se essa poderia ser uma conclusão ou seria uma forma de voltar, porque isso traria uma orientação mais adequada do que fazer, né? Então, qual que seria a solução? Acho que muitos aqui escutaram todas as debilidades da classificação 9 dos alimentos ultraprocessados, mas, então, qual que é o caminho a seguir? Se não falar em ultraprocessado, qual que é a forma que a gente deve ir? A parte de voltar aos grupos alimentares, pirâmides, pratos, seria uma alternativa ou vocês entendem que deveria ser feito de outro modo? Muito obrigada.
May I start with, because you mentioned the situation in Germany in particular. First of all, I would like to comment on your comments. You summarized our comments very correctly, so perfectly. Concerning the question whether the UPF concept is used in Germany or not, you're right, it is not used in Germany. So among food chemists, there's a broad, let's say, agreement that NOVA and UPF is a not scientifically valid concept. So if you speak to food chemists, then they will not accept this concept. They, at least according to my information, they're extremely critical. Among nutritionists, meaning the German Society of Nutrition, there is some debate, I should say. So they do not strictly refuse to use UPF, but they are aware of the fact that it is not a straightforward concept. So what is currently going on, but I must say that I'm not into this community in particular, but what is going on there is some kind of a discussion how to modify, how to evaluate probably some foods which are in this category 4 in order to highlight them more as potentially not so healthy. But I think the basic science behind this nutritionists also will lead to the fact that UPF will not be a basis for dietary recommendations. I'm speculating, but I think this will be the case. Concerning the second question, what can we do as an alternative? What alternative concepts we would suggest? I must say, I have no idea. I'm not a nutritionist, and as I mentioned before, why do we even know? Why do we even need labelings? I think this pyramid you mentioned, which is also valid in Europe or in the German Society of Nutrition, they have this pyramid, you know this, certain foods which should be eaten more often, some foods which should be eaten not so much, and alcohol on the top should be drank only one time per week, which is for me one of the hardest aspects of this pyramid. But this is of course a quite usable concept, and this is also something which can be, for my according to my opinion, can be included in dietary recommendations, because this also, as far as I can think, also brings the consumer to think about the foods not as classes of foods in terms of good or bad, but in terms of what is better in terms of the nutrient composition, and what is something which we should only eat, let's say, 1 or 2 times per week. So this is a much more scientifically based education system than classes of 1, 2, 3, 4, or of labels with red, yellow, and green.
Yeah. Just to add a little concept, I totally agree with what Thomas has just said, but I like my plate from USA. My plate shows, you know, for every meal, you know what to eat. And then base your meals on fruits and vegetables, eat meat twice a week, red meat twice a week. That type of advice, I think, is very clear for the consumer, as we used to do 50 years ago. I mean, basic nutrition science has not changed. The introduction of this new concept, which is a marketing concept for me, it's not even science, is not useful because it's not true. And we can see that, you know, the avoid ultra-processed foods has not served, at least in the last 10 years, hasn't shown any results because people do not know what to eat. See Chile, you know, they eat high-fat foods, they eat a lot of meat, they eat a lot of poultry, they eat less fish than they used to because it's very expensive. They do not reach even the dietary needs for fruits and vegetables. And the result can be seen very easily. So go back to the old science that is there, and I fully agree that you know exactly well why, you know, the concepts of that you have explained at the beginning of your message are correct. I do agree they are correct. Thank you.
Eu queria fazer só adendo, quando o Thomas falou sobre os sinais, né, que a gente tem o octógono lá, aqui a lupa, e tem o score, o Nutri-Score, né, na Alemanha. Só contar aqui rapidamente, meu filho ficou na Alemanha 2 meses, e ele faz medicina, está no 4º ano, e ele disse, mãe, aprendi a comer na Alemanha. Tudo que é verde não tem gosto bom e é muito caro. Então, eu escolho o vermelho porque mata a minha fome e é mais barato. Então, é uma forma de conhecer. Então, tem uma pergunta aqui da Lara.
Eu queria reafirmar a minha admiração pelo trabalho de vocês dois, não só por ser representante da Sban, mas também por ser pesquisadora na área. Eu queria trazer um outro ponto que vocês já abordaram também, mas que aqui no Brasil, a grande maioria do açúcar que as pessoas consomem a mais vem do açúcar que elas adicionam às suas preparações em casa. Então, ao café, ao suco, às preparações que essas suas receitas. A mesma coisa com o sódio e também com gordura. Queria entender um pouquinho como que é isso nos países em que vocês atuam e como que a gente aborda isso. Então, complementando as orientações nutricionais, como que vocês abordam esse fato de que, bom, como a gente tem no Brasil 20% só de consumo de alimentos prontos para consumo, e o resto vem do alimento que a gente prepara, né, em casa, e que a gente consome fora de casa, e grande parte do que a gente consome a mais e que pode ser prejudicial quando a gente consome em excesso para a nossa saúde, vem do que a gente adiciona aos alimentos, como é que a gente pode complementar a orientação dessa forma, como profissionais de saúde?
Again, thank you for your question. In Argentina, for instance, I know very well the data from my country. We consume 110 grams of sugar per day. The maximum allowed recommended level is 50 grams of added sugars, right? Because I like your lanchonetes, you know, where you have lunch, and they made the sucos, the fruta, and they add sugar to them. Well, if we want the population to eat less sugar, we need to communicate that intense or non-caloric sweeteners are safe for you. And you have of all varieties, people who think natural is better, they can, you know, take monk fruit and stevia-derived sweeteners. I need to say that most stevia sweeteners are not derived from the stevia leaf because there's new technology that allows you to make stevia without the plant. So steviol glycosides can be made by new technologies without the stevia plant. So that's another fake story that, you know, natural is better. It is not. It is as safe as a synthetic aspartame product. But we need to communicate that, because if we don't, and NOVA does not help, you will continue growing obese because you eat a lot of sugar and a lot of fat. And that's the story. And salt. We, in our asado, you know, our barbecue, we eat tons of red meat in Argentina and tons of salt in it. So, of course, it has nothing to do with packaged food or the badly called ultra-processed food. It has to do with the way we eat meat and French fries, but not from a package. We fry the potato. And so here comes our salt levels of consumption in Argentina. So, yes, and mostly salt in Brazil also from products that are produced in padarias, right? You have tons of bolinhos, tons of products that come from the local traditional food. So education is the only means. I mean, there's no way. There's no way. I think the intention was right. I do not blame the Nupens people for doing this. I think they thought this would help. We cannot accept it because we're scientists and we don't go, you know, we don't accept things that don't have a scientific base. It would change our spirits. We wouldn't be us. I would not, you know, say something is right when it's wrong. So education is paramount, and, you know, your dietary guidelines should be changed because they are flawed. Yeah. And they have not helped to, the Brazilian population.
Yeah, definitely. Nós temos uma última pergunta. Gente, eu ficava aqui o dia inteiro também, mas a Susana vai ter que pegar um voo. Então, o Rodrigo vai fazer a última pergunta e depois a gente encerra.
Na verdade, eu vou fazer um comentário, porque eu acho que já foram feitas tantas perguntas, né? Eu sei que hoje a abordagem aqui, a discussão, está em relação ao grupo número 4, a nova, né? Evitando exatamente o termo. Mas, historicamente, a gente já viu a área de alimentos receber novas propostas e hipóteses ao longo de muitos anos, né? É comum na área da ciência a gente fazer isso, né? Você apresenta uma hipótese e precisa colocar essa hipótese à prova, né? Então, vi de outros produtos, outras situações que nós tivemos na indústria de alimentos. Eu acredito que essa vai ser mais uma de várias que nós já passamos. Essa não vai ser a primeira e nem vai ser a última. Então, acho que esse é o ponto histórico que a gente precisa lembrar, né? E sugestões de alternativas, eu acho que muitas vão surgir daqui hoje, mas a gente gosta de brincar, né? Essa jabuticaba é nossa, né? Nós começamos ela aqui, não foi isso? E começou na ciência. Eu, como representante da ciência, né, assim, da universidade, nós começamos isso a partir de uma proposta científica que está sendo posta à prova, né? E nós precisamos de tempo para poder fazer essa hipótese, né, ser validada ou não. E a única forma que tem, quando começa na ciência, é continuar na ciência. A única forma que a gente pode acreditar é na ciência, né? O problema é que a gente gosta de falar que ciência ela não é rápida, né? A ciência ela não é pop, e a ciência ela não aceita desaforo. Então, definitivamente, o que a gente precisa é ter tempo para poder continuar essa discussão, né? Entender que ela não comunica de forma simples, então precisa de muito esforço, de muita ajuda de todo mundo que é envolvido nisso, tá? Definitivamente, mas que definitivamente o tempo, né? Só o tempo vai mostrar o caminho certo, né? O pessoal costuma dizer o seguinte, que o tempo é o senhor da verdade e o demolidor de toda incoerência. Então, nós precisamos de ter um pouco mais de tempo para poder provar, né, de uma forma mais simples, ou como todas as propostas aqui, que esse termo definitivamente deve ser abolido, né, de toda a cadeia de ensino que nós temos, de toda a cadeia de divulgação de mídia que nós temos, de qualquer área, porque isso não é ciência, tá certo? Isso é qualquer outra coisa menos ciência, mas é tempo. E, infelizmente, hoje as pessoas não têm tempo, né, para poder esperar por nada. Mas nós vamos ter que trabalhar muito duro em relação a isso, e só coletivamente a gente poder mostrar aqui uma hipótese que é proposta, que ciência é feita assim. Apresenta a hipótese e deixa discutir. Agora, se não querem discutir, é diferente, né? Eu acho que esse fórum aqui exatamente se propõe a isso, a discussão, né? Mais tempo. Vamos precisar de mais tempo para poder fechar isso.
Ok, Rodrigo, obrigada. E completando o que o Rodrigo está dizendo, né, tem aquela frase, não é exatamente assim, mas é que para todo problema complexo sempre tem uma solução muito simples e totalmente errada, né? Então, por isso que precisa de tempo. Eu queria agradecer, porque tempo nós não temos mais, a Susana tem um voo, ainda vai almoçar, e eu quero agradecer muitíssimo, Susana, Thomas, eu estou, assim, emocionada de ter realizado esse trabalho. Assim, vocês são pessoas queridas, assim, são meus ídolos, e eu consegui fazer um trabalho, assim, com a ajuda de muita gente e colocar isso aqui em pé. Agradeço muito a Sban de ter topado, e eu acho que a gente tem que fazer mais. E então, vamos em frente. Obrigada, gente.
Obrigada a vocês.
Thank you very much.